Part 1. The Young Medium, Hélène Preiswerk. Carl Gustav Jung's first encounter with the mysterious depths of the human psyche began not in a laboratory or clinical setting, but in the shadowy world of seances with his 15-year-old cousin, Hélène Preiswerk. Born in 1881, Hélène was a member of Jung's extended family on his mother's side, the Preiswerks, who were known throughout Basel for their supposed psychic abilities and eccentric spiritual practices. Jung's maternal grandfather, Samuel Preiswerk, was an eccentric theologian who claimed to converse with the dead and devoted his life to learning Hebrew, believing it was the language spoken in heaven. This family background of spiritual mysticism provided the perfect environment for what would become Jung's first serious psychological investigation. The séances began in 1899, when Jung was a 24-year-old medical student at the University of Basel. Hélène had started displaying remarkable abilities during family gatherings, entering trance states where she would speak in different voices and claim to channel spirits of the deceased. What fascinated Jung most was not just the apparent supernatural phenomena, but the dramatic personality changes that occurred during these sessions. When Hélène entered her trance state, she would transform from a nervous, brittle teenager into someone entirely different. Her primary spirit guide was named Ivanes, who Jung described as an older, serious and deeply sorrowful person who possessed clear memories of the visions and experiences that occurred during the séances. Ivanes spoke with authority and wisdom that seemed far beyond Hélène's years and education. But Ivanes was not the only personality to emerge during these sessions. Multiple spirits would allegedly speak through Hélène, including historical figures and family members who had passed away, each with distinct voices, mannerisms and knowledge. Jung was initially a true believer in these phenomena, convinced that he was witnessing genuine communication with the spirit world. He spent countless hours documenting every detail of the séances, recording the messages, studying the different personalities, and trying to understand the mechanisms behind these extraordinary occurrences. For 2 years, from 1899 to 1900, Jung devoted himself to this investigation with the same methodical approach he would later bring to his psychological research. The relationship between Jung and his young cousin was complex and, by modern standards, deeply problematic. Jung would meet with Hélène alone in darkened rooms, initiating her trance states by tapping on tables between them. He gave her books about famous mediums and séances, including The Clairvoyante of Preiswerk, which told the story of a famous medium's dramatic sessions and supernatural experiences. These books clearly influenced the content of Hélène's subsequent visions and the types of phenomena that occurred during their private sessions. The family dynamics surrounding these séances were equally disturbing. There were whispers of sexual tension between Jung and his attractive young cousin, and the intimate nature of their private sessions caused scandal within the family. Jung's mother, Emilie, who had her own history of mental illness and claimed to be visited by spirits at night, was both fascinated and troubled by her son's obsession with Hélène's abilities. The weekly Saturday night gatherings became increasingly charged with psychological and emotional undercurrents that Jung was not yet equipped to understand or analyze. As the months passed, Jung began to notice subtle changes in the quality of the phenomena. The messages became more repetitive and less impressive, and he started to suspect that Hélène was beginning to fabricate some of her experiences. His scientific training began to conflict with his spiritual beliefs, and he found himself torn between his desire to believe and his growing skepticism. The dramatic climax came when Hélène was caught red-handed cheating during a séance, having hidden objects in her dress that she threw into the air during darkened sessions to create supernatural effects. This discovery shattered Jung's faith in the literal reality of the séances, But it also opened his eyes to something far more profound and scientifically important. He realized that whether or not the spirits were real, the psychological phenomena he had witnessed were undeniably genuine. Hélène's multiple personalities, her ability to access knowledge and wisdom beyond her conscious understanding, and the dramatic transformations of her entire being pointed to the existence of layers of the psyche that were largely unknown to science. Jung's doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena would transform these early experiences into the foundation of his revolutionary psychological theories. He reframed Hélène's mediumship as an example of dissociative identity disorder and used her case to explore the concept of autonomous complexes within the unconscious mind. What had begun as a search for proof of life after death became the first systematic investigation into the multiplicity of the human psyche and the autonomous nature of unconscious contents. The tragic aftermath of these experiments would haunt Jung for years to come. Hélène never recovered from the scandal and psychological damage caused by her involvement in the séances. She withdrew from the family, struggled with mental health issues, and eventually died in obscurity, becoming one of the first casualties of Jung's relentless pursuit of psychological truth. This early experience taught Jung that the exploration of the unconscious mind was not without its dangers, and that the researcher must be prepared to face the full consequences of unleashing forces that are not yet fully understood. Part 2. The Secret Séance Circle. The weekly Saturday night séances in the Preiswerk household were far more than simple family gatherings. They were elaborate psychological experiments conducted in an atmosphere of secrecy and spiritual intensity. Jung's mother, Emily Preiswerk Jung, served as the primary organizer of these sessions, drawing upon her family's long tradition of supernatural experiences and spiritual communication. The Preiswerk family had been known throughout Basel for generations as having unusual psychic abilities, and Emily herself claimed to be regularly visited by spirits during the night, experiences that had contributed to her nervous breakdown when Jung was only 3 years old. The séance circle typically consisted of Jung, his mother Emilie, his cousin Hélène, and several other family members who rotated in and out of the sessions depending on availability and interest. The gatherings took place in a darkened room in the family home, with participants seated around a table in a circle, creating an atmosphere of heightened expectation and psychological tension. The sessions would begin with the participants placing their fingers on an upturned glass, surrounded by letters written on pieces of paper, allowing the spirits to spell out messages by moving the glass from letter to letter. Jung approached these sessions with the methodical precision of a scientist. Even though he was still a true believer in the supernatural phenomena he was witnessing. He developed careful protocols for recording everything that occurred during the séances, noting the time, the participants present, the atmospheric conditions, and every detail of the messages and phenomena that emerged. He created detailed charts tracking the different personalities that spoke through Hélène, documenting their unique characteristics, speech patterns, and the specific knowledge they claimed to possess. This systematic approach would later serve him well in his psychological research, even though his conclusions about the nature of these phenomena would dramatically change. The atmosphere during these sessions was charged with psychological and emotional intensity that went far beyond simple curiosity about the afterlife. The participants genuinely believed they were communicating with deceased family members and historical figures, and this belief created a powerful group dynamic that amplified the psychological effects of the experience. Jung noted that certain participants seemed to enhance Hélène's abilities, while others appeared to disrupt them, suggesting that the group's collective psychological state played a crucial role in the phenomena that occurred. The family treated these communications as genuine messages from the spirit world, often receiving advice about personal matters, family conflicts, and important decisions. Jung's maternal grandfather, Samuel Preiswerk, was the most frequent spirit visitor, appearing as a protective figure who claimed to watch over Hélène and guide the family through difficult times. Other deceased relatives would also manifest, each bringing their own personality and concerns from beyond the grave. The messages often contained information that seemed to be beyond Hélène's conscious knowledge, including details about family history and events that had occurred before her birth. As the sessions continued week after week, Jung began to notice patterns in the way the phenomena manifested. He observed that Hélène's trance states followed a predictable sequence, beginning with physical symptoms like trembling and changes in breathing, followed by the gradual emergence of different personalities with their own distinct voices and mannerisms. He also noted that the content of the messages seemed to reflect the psychological preoccupations and emotional needs of the participants, even though this connection was not immediately obvious to those involved. The recording methods Jung developed during these sessions would later influence his approach to dream analysis and active imagination techniques. He learned to pay attention not just to the content of what was being communicated, but to the symbolic meanings and emotional undertones that accompanied each message. He began to see that the spirits were not just delivering factual information, but were expressing deep psychological truths about the participants and their relationships with each other. This insight would eventually lead him to understand that the unconscious mind has its own intelligence and can communicate through symbolic means. The strange phenomena witnessed during these sessions went beyond simple verbal communication. Participants reported seeing apparitions, hearing mysterious sounds, and experiencing sudden changes in temperature and atmospheric pressure. Objects would sometimes move without apparent cause, and Hélène would occasionally demonstrate knowledge of events occurring in distant locations or predictions about future occurrences that would later prove accurate. Jung meticulously documented all of these phenomena, trying to find rational explanations while remaining open to the possibility that he was witnessing something genuinely supernatural. The psychological dynamics within the Séance circle were complex and often fraught with tension. Jung's intense focus on Hélène and his obvious fascination with her abilities created jealousy and resentment among other family members. His mother, Emily, was torn between pride in her son's intellectual pursuits and concern about his growing obsession with phenomena that reminded her of her own struggles with mental illness. The weekly gatherings became a focal point for family conflicts and unresolved psychological issues that would surface through the medium of the séances. As Jung's medical training progressed and his scientific skepticism began to develop, he started to question the literal reality of what he was witnessing. He began to notice inconsistencies in the messages, repetitions that suggested psychological rather than supernatural origins, and a gradual decline in the quality and originality of the phenomena. The sessions that had once filled him with wonder and excitement now began to feel stale and artificial, as if Hélène was struggling to maintain her role as a medium while her natural abilities were beginning to fade. This growing disillusionment would ultimately lead to his withdrawal from the séances and his discovery of Hélène's attempts to create artificial phenomena through trickery and deception. Part 3. Channeling the Dead. The spirits that allegedly spoke through Hélène Preiswerk during the séances were not merely anonymous voices from beyond, but distinct personalities with elaborate histories, complex relationships, and specific messages for the living. Jung meticulously documented each of these supernatural visitors, creating what amounted to a psychological portrait gallery of the deceased, that would later provide crucial insights into the structure and dynamics of the unconscious mind. These otherworldly communications revealed patterns and themes that went far beyond simple wish fulfillment or fraud, pointing to deeper psychological processes that Jung was only beginning to understand. The most prominent and influential spirit to manifest through Hélène was her alleged grandfather, Samuel Preiswerk, Jung's maternal grandfather, who had died before her birth. Samuel appeared as a protective and authoritative figure who claimed to have watched over Hélène throughout her childhood and to possess intimate knowledge of her thoughts and feelings. During the séances, Samuel would speak with the voice of wisdom and experience, offering guidance to the family and providing information about events in the spirit world that no living person could possibly know. His communications were characterized by a deep concern for family welfare and a strong moral authority that impressed all the participants. Another recurring spirit visitor was the mysterious Countess of Telepathy, an aristocratic figure who claimed to have lived in the 15th century and to have been reincarnated multiple times throughout history. The Countess spoke with elaborate formality and claimed to possess secret knowledge about historical events and hidden spiritual truths. She would describe in vivid detail her various past lives, including experiences as a Christian martyr, a medieval noblewoman, and a mystic who had achieved special communion with divine forces. Her stories were so detailed and consistent that Jung found himself both fascinated and disturbed by the depth of historical knowledge that seemed to emerge from his teenage cousin's unconscious mind. Historical figures also made appearances during the séances, including various saints, philosophers, and religious leaders who would speak through Hélène with their own distinctive voices and perspectives. These figures would engage in complex theological discussions, debate philosophical questions, and provide insights into the nature of existence that seemed far beyond Hélène's conscious education and understanding. Jung was particularly struck by the consistency of these personalities over time, as each spirit maintained the same basic character traits, speech patterns, and areas of knowledge from session to session. This observation would later contribute to his understanding of autonomous complexes within the unconscious mind. The most disturbing and psychologically significant spirit to emerge during the séances was a dark figure who claimed to be an ancient evil entity, seeking to influence the living world through Hélène's mediumship. This malevolent presence would sometimes interrupt the peaceful communications from benevolent spirits, creating an atmosphere of fear and spiritual danger that left all participants deeply shaken. The entity would speak in threatening tones, make disturbing predictions about future catastrophes, and attempt to manipulate the family members into actions that would serve its mysterious purposes. Jung observed that these dark manifestations seemed to correlate with periods of particular stress or conflict within the family, suggesting that the evil spirit might be a projection of repressed negative emotions and unconscious fears. Jung's evolving beliefs about these phenomena reflected his journey from naive acceptance to sophisticated psychological understanding. Initially, he accepted the spirit communications at face value, believing that he was witnessing genuine contact with the deceased and proof of life after death. He was particularly impressed by the spirit's apparent knowledge of information that Hélène could not have known through normal means, including details about family history, historical events, and future occurrences that would later prove accurate. This seeming evidence of supernatural knowledge strengthened his faith in the reality of the communications and convinced him that he was participating in something of profound spiritual significance. As the séances continued, and Jung's scientific training developed, he began to notice patterns that suggested psychological rather than supernatural explanations for the phenomena. He observed that the spirit's messages often reflected the unconscious desires, fears, and conflicts of the participants, even when this connection was not immediately obvious. The historical figures spoke about issues that were particularly relevant to the family's current situation, and the advice they offered seemed to emerge from a deep understanding of the psychological dynamics within the group. Jung began to suspect that the spirits were not external entities, but were instead manifestations of the unconscious minds of the participants, particularly Hélène's extraordinarily creative and dissociative psyche. The content of the spirit communications also revealed recurring themes that would later become central to Jung's psychological theories. The spirits frequently spoke about the need for spiritual transformation, the importance of integrating opposing forces within the personality, and the existence of hidden knowledge that could only be accessed through special states of consciousness. These messages contained elements that Jung would later recognize as archetypal patterns found in myths, religions, and dreams across all cultures, suggesting that the séances were tapping into universal structures of the human psyche rather than communicating with actual deceased individuals. The gradual deterioration of the spirit communications provided Jung with crucial insights into the nature of psychological phenomena. As the séances continued, the messages became increasingly repetitive and less impressive, and the spirits began to contradict themselves and provide information that proved to be false. Jung noticed that Hélène seemed to be struggling to maintain her role as a medium, and that she was beginning to rely on conscious fabrication to supplement her diminishing unconscious abilities. This decline in quality coincided with Hélène's increasing self-consciousness about her role and her growing awareness of the psychological mechanisms behind her trance states. The discovery of Hélène's deliberate fraud did not invalidate Jung's interest in the psychological aspects of the séances, but rather deepened his understanding of the complex relationship between conscious and unconscious processes. He realized that even when the medium was consciously fabricating phenomena, the content of the fabrications still revealed important psychological truths about the participants and their unconscious motivations. The spirits that had seemed so real and distinct were actually creative products of the human psyche, but this psychological reality was no less significant than any supernatural explanation would have been. This insight marked the beginning of Jung's lifelong fascination with the autonomous nature of unconscious contents and their ability to manifest as apparently independent personalities within the human mind. Part 4. The Burgholzli Experiments. Jung's transition from believer in the supernatural to rigorous psychological scientist began in earnest when he joined the staff of the Burgholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in 1900. Under the supervision of Eugen Bleuler, who would later coin the term schizophrenia, Jung began developing experimental methods that would revolutionize the understanding of the unconscious mind. His most famous innovation was the word association test, a deceptively simple technique that would reveal the hidden complexes and repressed memories that governed human behavior. These experiments represented Jung's first systematic attempt to bridge the gap between the mysterious phenomena he had witnessed during the séances and the scientific method he was learning to apply in his psychiatric work. The word association test was based on the principle that people's responses to carefully selected words would reveal unconscious associations and emotional conflicts that they were not consciously aware of. Jung would present patients with a list of stimulus words and ask them to respond immediately with the first word that came to mind, while carefully measuring their response time and observing their emotional reactions. He discovered that certain words would produce unusually long response times, emotional disturbances, and other signs of psychological distress, indicating that these words had touched upon sensitive areas of the patient's unconscious mind. These areas of heightened sensitivity, which Jung called complexes, represented autonomous clusters of thoughts, feelings and memories that operated independently of conscious control. To make his measurements more precise and objective, Jung introduced the use of a galvanometer, an early type of lie detector that measured subtle changes in the electrical conductivity of the skin. This device allowed him to detect unconscious emotional responses even when patients were consciously trying to hide their reactions or were genuinely unaware of their own psychological responses. The galvanometer readings would spike dramatically when patients encountered words that were connected to their unconscious complexes, providing objective evidence of psychological processes that had previously been impossible to measure scientifically. This combination of psychological observation and physiological measurement represented a breakthrough in the scientific study of the unconscious mind. Jung's experiments revealed that the human psyche was far more complex and autonomous than anyone had previously imagined. He discovered that complexes could act as independent psychological entities with their own memories, emotions, and behavioral patterns that could influence a person's actions without their conscious awareness. Patients would sometimes respond to stimulus words with associations that seemed to come from a completely different personality, suggesting that multiple autonomous systems were operating simultaneously within the same individual. These findings provided Jung with a scientific explanation for the multiple personalities he had observed in his cousin Hélène, reframing her mediumistic abilities as an extreme example of the dissociative processes that exist to some degree in everyone. The timing measurements from the word association tests proved to be particularly revealing about the structure of unconscious processes. Jung found that responses connected to complexes were not only delayed, but also showed characteristic patterns of emotional disturbance and physiological arousal that could be measured and analyzed. He developed sophisticated statistical methods for interpreting these response patterns, creating what amounted to a psychological mapping system for the unconscious mind. Patients with similar psychological problems showed similar patterns of response delays and emotional reactions, suggesting that there were universal structures and processes underlying individual psychological experiences. The experimental work at Burgholzli also revealed the surprising extent to which unconscious complexes could influence conscious behavior and decision-making. Jung observed that patients would often make seemingly rational choices that were actually being guided by unconscious emotional factors they were completely unaware of. The word association tests could predict with remarkable accuracy which topics would be most difficult for patients to discuss in therapy and which areas of their lives were most likely to be sources of psychological conflict. This predictive power demonstrated that the unconscious mind was not simply a repository of forgotten memories, but an active system that was constantly influencing conscious experience in ways that could be scientifically studied and understood. Jung's galvanometer experiments also provided evidence for what he would later call the collective unconscious, though he had not yet developed this concept fully. He noticed that certain stimulus words would produce similar response patterns across many different patients, even when these patients had no apparent connection to each other or shared cultural background. These universal response patterns suggested that there were deeper levels of the unconscious mind that contained shared psychological structures and archetypal patterns that transcended individual experience. This observation would later become the foundation for Jung's theory of the collective unconscious and his understanding of the archetypal basis of human psychology. The practical applications of Jung's experimental methods extended far beyond the laboratory into the realm of criminal investigation and legal proceedings. He demonstrated that the word association test could be used to detect hidden knowledge and unconscious guilt in criminal suspects, providing law enforcement with a powerful new tool for psychological investigation. The galvanometer readings could reveal when suspects were lying or concealing information, even when they were consciously trying to appear innocent. These applications brought Jung's work to the attention of the broader public and established his reputation as a pioneer in the scientific study of the unconscious mind. The success of the word association experiments also attracted the attention of Sigmund Freud, who recognized Jung as a kindred spirit in the exploration of unconscious processes. The correspondence between Jung and Freud began largely because of Jung's experimental validation of Freudian concepts about repression and the unconscious, though Jung's methods were more scientifically rigorous and objective than Freud's purely analytical approach. This collaboration would prove to be both professionally stimulating and personally problematic, as Jung's experimental findings would eventually lead him to conclusions that contradicted some of Freud's fundamental assumptions about the nature of the unconscious mind. The Burgholzli Experiments established Jung as a leading figure in the new field of experimental psychology, and provided him with the scientific credibility he needed to pursue his more controversial interests in occult and mystical phenomena. By demonstrating that unconscious processes could be studied objectively and measured scientifically, Jung created a bridge between the rational world of medical science and the mysterious realm of the psyche that he had first encountered during the séances with his cousin Hélène. These experiments proved that the strange phenomena he had witnessed were not supernatural, but were instead manifestations of natural psychological processes that could be understood and studied through scientific methods. Part 5. The Dementia Praecox Studies. Jung's work with schizophrenic patients at the Burgholzli Hospital led to one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of psychology, providing unexpected evidence for what would become his theory of the collective unconscious. In 1906, while working with a patient suffering from dementia praecox, as schizophrenia was then known, Jung encountered a vision that would revolutionize his understanding of the human psyche and challenge the fundamental assumptions of psychiatric treatment. The patient, whom Jung referred to only as a chronic schizophrenic, approached him one day with great excitement and pointed to the sun, insisting that Jung look at a peculiar phenomenon that only he could see. The patient claimed to see a phallus hanging from the sun, and he demonstrated how this solar phallus would sway back and forth when he moved his head from side to side. He explained to Jung that this swaying motion of the solar phallus was the source of the wind, and that he had been granted a special vision that revealed the hidden mechanisms behind natural phenomena. Jung initially dismissed this as a typical psychotic delusion, the kind of bizarre and meaningless hallucination that was common among patients with severe mental illness. However, 4 years later, Jung would discover that this seemingly random delusion contained elements that were far more significant than he had ever imagined. In 1910, Jung was studying a recently published scholarly work on Mithraic mysteries when he came across a passage that made his blood run cold. The ancient text described a vision that was remarkably similar to what his schizophrenic patient had reported years earlier, including the image of a phallus hanging from the sun and the belief that the movement of this solar phallus was responsible for creating the wind. The Mithraic text was from a Greek papyrus that had been discovered in Egypt and dated to several centuries before Christ, making it impossible for Jung's patient to have had any knowledge of its contents. This discovery suggested that the patient's delusion was not a random product of mental illness, but was instead connected to ancient archetypal patterns that had been present in human consciousness for thousands of years. Jung's investigation into the Mithraic parallels revealed that the solar phallus vision was part of a complex mythological system that had been central to one of the most important mystery religions of the ancient world. Mithraism was a secretive cult that had been particularly popular among Roman soldiers and had competed with Christianity for dominance in the Roman Empire. The cult's sacred texts and rituals contained numerous references to solar symbolism and phallic imagery, suggesting that Jung's patient had somehow accessed mythological material that was embedded in the deepest layers of the human psyche. This discovery provided Jung with the first concrete evidence that the human mind contained inherited psychological structures that transcended individual experience and cultural learning. The implications of this discovery were staggering for Jung's understanding of mental illness and the nature of the unconscious mind. If schizophrenic patients could spontaneously produce mythological material that they had never been exposed to through normal cultural channels, then their delusions might not be meaningless symptoms of brain dysfunction, but could instead be distorted expressions of universal psychological patterns. Jung began to reconsider his entire approach to treating mental illness, wondering whether some forms of psychosis might represent unsuccessful attempts by the psyche to integrate archetypal material that was emerging from the collective unconscious. This perspective suggested that treatment should focus not on simply suppressing symptoms, but on helping patients understand and integrate the mythological content of their experiences. Jung's continued work with schizophrenic patients revealed numerous other examples of archetypal material appearing in psychotic episodes. Patients would describe visions of ancient gods and goddesses, report encounters with mythological creatures, and experience religious revelations that closely paralleled the content of sacred texts from cultures they had never studied. These phenomena occurred with such regularity that Jung began to see them as a normal feature of severe mental illness rather than as random aberrations. He started to develop a new understanding of schizophrenia as a condition in which the barriers between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious had broken down, allowing archetypal material to flood into consciousness without proper integration. The solar phallus case also provided Jung with crucial insights into the relationship between individual psychological development and universal human experiences. He realized that the same archetypal patterns that appeared in distorted form in psychotic episodes were also present in the dreams, fantasies, and creative expressions of healthy individuals. The difference was that mentally healthy people were able to integrate archetypal material gradually and constructively, while schizophrenic patients were overwhelmed by sudden and uncontrollable invasions of collective unconscious content. This understanding led Jung to develop therapeutic techniques that focused on helping patients establish a healthy relationship with archetypal material rather than simply trying to eliminate it from their consciousness. Jung's Dementia Praecox studies also revealed the profound connection between individual psychological problems and universal human conflicts. He observed that many schizophrenic patients seem to be struggling with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose and identity that were central to the human condition. Their delusions often contained attempts to resolve these existential conflicts, though in distorted and ultimately unsuccessful ways. Jung began to see mental illness not as a purely medical problem, but as a spiritual crisis that required understanding and integration, rather than simple symptom management. The research into archetypal patterns in schizophrenia also provided Jung with evidence for the autonomous nature of unconscious contents. He noticed that patients would often describe their delusions as being imposed upon them by external forces, suggesting that archetypal material had its own independent existence within the psyche. The solar phallus vision, for example, appeared to the patient as an objective reality that he was discovering rather than creating, indicating that archetypal images possessed a kind of psychological objectivity that was distinct from conscious thought processes. This observation would later become central to Jung's understanding of the autonomous nature of complexes and archetypal patterns. The implications of Jung's dementia Praecox studies extended far beyond the treatment of mental illness to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness and cultural development. If archetypal patterns were indeed inherited psychological structures that shaped human experience across cultures and historical periods, then many aspects of religion, mythology and artistic expression might be understood as collective attempts to give form and meaning to these universal psychological contents. Jung began to see his work with schizophrenic patients as providing a window into the deepest levels of human nature and the evolutionary origins of consciousness itself. This perspective would eventually lead to his development of analytical psychology as a comprehensive understanding of the human psyche that encompassed both individual and collective dimensions of psychological experience. Part 6. The Occult Library. Behind the walls of Jung's home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, lay one of the most extraordinary private libraries ever assembled, a vast collection of over 4,000 books on alchemy, occultism, mysticism and esoteric traditions from around the world. This hidden treasure trove represented Jung's lifelong quest to understand the deepest mysteries of the human psyche, through the study of humanity's most secretive and forbidden knowledge. The library was not merely a scholarly collection, but a working laboratory where Jung conducted his most controversial research, seeking to unlock the psychological secrets embedded in texts that had been dismissed by mainstream academia as primitive superstition or dangerous nonsense. Jung's interest in occult literature began during his medical school years, when he first encountered the works of medieval alchemists and discovered that their cryptic symbols and mysterious processes seemed to parallel the psychological transformations he was observing in his patients. He began to collect alchemical texts with the same methodical precision he brought to his scientific research, eventually amassing one of the most comprehensive collections of Hermetic literature in private hands. The library contained original manuscripts dating back to the 13th century, rare printed editions of classical alchemical works, and modern translations of texts that had been preserved in monastery libraries for hundreds of years. Each volume was carefully catalogued and cross-referenced, allowing Jung to trace the evolution of symbolic systems across cultures and historical periods. The crown jewel of Jung's occult library was his collection of Gnostic texts, including several rare manuscripts that had been acquired through private dealers and scholarly connections. These ancient Christian writings, which had been declared heretical by the early Church and suppressed for centuries, contained psychological insights that Jung found remarkably similar to his own discoveries about the nature of the unconscious mind. The Gnostic emphasis on inner knowledge, the integration of opposing forces, and the existence of a divine spark within each individual resonated strongly with Jung's understanding of the individuation process and the relationship between the ego and the self. He spent countless hours studying these texts, translating obscure passages and extracting psychological principles that he would later incorporate into his therapeutic methods. Jung's collection also included extensive holdings in Eastern philosophy and religion, with particular emphasis on Hindu and Buddhist texts that explored the nature of consciousness and the techniques for achieving psychological transformation. He owned rare Sanskrit manuscripts, early translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and commentaries on meditation practices that had been closely guarded secrets of monastic communities. These Eastern texts provided Jung with alternative perspectives on psychological development that complemented and enriched his understanding of Western depth psychology. He was particularly fascinated by the concept of the mandala in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, recognizing it as a universal symbol of psychological wholeness that appeared spontaneously in the dreams and fantasies of his patients. The library's collection of medieval and Renaissance alchemical texts was perhaps the most important source of inspiration for Jung's later theoretical developments. He owned works by all the major alchemical masters, including Paracelsus, Ramon Lull, Nicolas Flamel, and Johannes Mercator, as well as numerous anonymous treatises that had been passed down through secret traditions. Jung discovered that alchemical symbolism provided a sophisticated psychological language for describing the processes of transformation and integration that he was observing in his therapeutic work. The alchemical quest for the philosopher's stone, which could supposedly transform base metals into gold, was actually a symbolic representation of the psychological journey toward wholeness and self-realization. Jung's study of these esoteric texts revealed recurring patterns and symbols that appeared across different cultures and historical periods, providing further evidence for his theory of the collective unconscious. He found that the same archetypal images and transformational processes appeared in Gnostic Christianity, Islamic mysticism, Hindu Tantra, and medieval European alchemy, suggesting that these traditions were all describing the same fundamental psychological realities using different symbolic languages. This discovery convinced Jung that the world's esoteric traditions contained a hidden wisdom about the nature of consciousness that had been preserved through centuries of persecution and suppression. He began to see his role not just as a psychologist, but as a translator and interpreter of this ancient knowledge for the modern world. The practical applications of Jung's occult studies extended directly into his therapeutic work with patients. He would often draw upon alchemical and mystical symbolism to help patients understand their dreams and psychological experiences, using the rich imagery of esoteric traditions to illuminate the meaning of unconscious contents. Jung found that patients who were struggling with spiritual crises or existential questions often responded more positively to interpretations based on mystical and alchemical concepts than to purely medical or psychological explanations. The symbolic language of the occult provided a bridge between the rational world of scientific psychology and the mysterious realm of spiritual experience that many patients were seeking to understand. Jung's library also contained extensive collections of works on astrology, divination, and magical practices, subjects that he studied not as literal beliefs, but as psychological projection systems that revealed the workings of the unconscious mind. He was particularly interested in the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination system, which he saw as a sophisticated method for accessing unconscious knowledge through the principle of synchronicity. Jung's collection included numerous commentaries on the I Ching, as well as other divinatory texts from various cultures, all of which he studied as examples of humanity's attempt to understand the meaningful connections between inner psychological states and outer events. The secrecy surrounding Jung's occult library was necessary due to the controversial nature of his interests and the potential damage they could cause to his professional reputation. During the early 20th century, serious engagement with occult and mystical subjects was considered professionally dangerous for a scientist, and Jung was careful to present his research in psychological rather than spiritual terms. He would often refer to his occult studies as research into the history of symbols or comparative mythology, avoiding direct discussion of his genuine fascination with the practical applications of esoteric knowledge. This discretion allowed him to continue his unconventional research while maintaining his position as a respected figure in the psychiatric establishment. The influence of Jung's occult library on his theoretical development cannot be overstated, as it provided him with a vast reservoir of symbolic material that enriched and deepened his understanding of the human psyche. The alchemical concept of the union of opposites became central to his theory of psychological integration, while Gnostic ideas about the divine spark within each individual informed his understanding of the self-archetype. Eastern meditation practices influenced his development of active imagination techniques, and divinatory systems provided models for understanding synchronicity and the meaningful connections between psychological and physical events. The library was not just a collection of books, but a living laboratory where Jung conducted some of his most important research into the deepest mysteries of human consciousness and the hidden connections between individual psychological development and universal spiritual truths. Part 7. The Red Book Creation Process. Between 1913 and 1930, Carl Jung embarked on what he would later describe as his most dangerous experiment, a systematic exploration of his own unconscious mind that would produce one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of psychology. The Red Book, or Liber Novus as Jung originally titled it, was created through a revolutionary technique that Jung called active imagination, a process of deliberately allowing unconscious contents to emerge into consciousness and then engaging with them as if they were living beings. This massive illuminated manuscript, with its vivid paintings and elaborate Gothic calligraphy, represented Jung's attempt to map the deepest territories of the human psyche and document the psychological processes that he believed were universal aspects of human development. The creation of the Red Book began during Jung's break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, a period of intense personal and professional crisis that left Jung feeling isolated and uncertain about his future direction. Deprived of the intellectual companionship and theoretical framework that his relationship with Freud had provided, Jung found himself confronting fundamental questions about the nature of the unconscious mind and his own psychological development. Rather than seeking external guidance or returning to conventional psychiatric practice, Jung made the extraordinary decision to turn inward and explore his own unconscious processes as a source of new knowledge and understanding. This decision would prove to be both personally transformative and professionally dangerous, as it led him into territories that were far beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific practice. Jung's technique for accessing unconscious material was based on what he called letting himself drop, a deliberate process of relaxing conscious control and allowing fantasies and images to emerge spontaneously from the depths of his psyche. He would sit quietly in his study, often in the evening after his family had gone to bed, and enter a state of receptive attention that was similar to meditation, but with a more active engagement with whatever arose. Instead of simply observing his thoughts and feelings, Jung would interact with the images and figures that appeared in his mind, asking them questions, engaging them in dialogue, and allowing them to guide him through elaborate psychological dramas. This process required enormous courage and psychological stability, as Jung never knew what kind of disturbing or challenging material might emerge from his unconscious depths. The preliminary work for the Red Book was recorded in a series of 6 journals that Jung called the Black Books, small notebooks in which he would hastily scribble down the visions and conversations that emerged during his sessions of active imagination. These journals contained the raw material of Jung's inner experiences, including dialogue with mysterious figures, descriptions of fantastical landscapes, and accounts of psychological transformations that seemed to occur outside the normal boundaries of space and time. The Black Books were written in a mixture of German and Latin, with occasional passages in other languages, and they contained numerous drawings and sketches that Jung used to capture visual aspects of his visions that could not be adequately described in words. These preliminary records provided the foundation for the more elaborate and artistic treatment that would appear in the Red Book itself. The process of transforming the material from the Black Books into the Red Book was itself a form of active imagination, as Jung carefully selected and revised his experiences to create a coherent narrative of psychological development. He would spend hours crafting the Gothic calligraphy that gave the Red Book its medieval appearance, treating each page as a work of art that reflected the sacred nature of the material he was recording. The elaborate script was not merely decorative, but was intended to slow down the reading process and create a meditative state that would help readers enter into the psychological space that Jung was describing. Each letter was carefully formed by hand, with ornate initial capitals and decorative borders that were reminiscent of medieval illuminated manuscripts. The paintings and illustrations in the Red Book were created through the same process of active imagination that Jung used for the written material, allowing images to emerge spontaneously from his unconscious and then giving them form through artistic expression. Jung had no formal training as an artist, but he found that the creative process itself was more important than technical skill in capturing the psychological essence of his visions. The paintings often combined realistic and symbolic elements in ways that reflected the fluid boundaries between conscious and unconscious experience, with figures and landscapes that seemed to exist in a dreamlike realm that was neither fully internal nor external. These artistic creations served as both records of Jung's psychological experiences and as active agents in his ongoing process of individuation. The content of the Red Book was organized around Jung's encounters with various inner figures who seemed to possess independent personalities and wisdom that transcended his conscious knowledge. These figures included Philemon, a wise old man with the wings of a kingfisher, who became Jung's primary inner guide and teacher; Salome, a beautiful and dangerous woman who represented the anima or feminine aspect of Jung's psyche; and Elijah, a prophet figure who provided spiritual guidance and insight. Jung's conversations with these figures were not fantasy dialogues, but were experienced as genuine encounters with autonomous aspects of his own psyche that possessed their own knowledge, perspectives, and agendas. Through these relationships, Jung began to understand that the unconscious mind contained not just repressed memories and instinctual drives, but also wise and creative aspects that could serve as guides for psychological development. The Red Book also contained Jung's attempts to understand the historical and cultural significance of his personal psychological experiences. He began to see his own journey through the unconscious as a modern version of the hero's journey that appeared in myths and legends from around the world, and he tried to connect his individual experiences to universal patterns of human development. The book contained numerous references to religious and mythological traditions, as Jung attempted to place his psychological discoveries within the broader context of human spiritual development. This comparative approach would later become central to his theory of the collective unconscious and his understanding of the archetypal patterns that shape human experience across cultures and historical periods. The creation of the Red Book was not without its psychological dangers, as Jung's deep exploration of unconscious material brought him face to face with disturbing and potentially destabilizing aspects of his own psyche. He experienced periods of confusion, depression, and near-psychotic episodes as he struggled to integrate the powerful contents that were emerging from his unconscious mind. Jung later described this period as his confrontation with the unconscious, acknowledging that he had come dangerously close to losing his psychological equilibrium in his quest to understand the deeper mysteries of the human psyche. The Red Book served as both a record of this dangerous journey and as a tool for maintaining psychological stability by giving form and meaning to experiences that might otherwise have overwhelmed his conscious mind. The 16-year process of creating the Red Book was never completed to Jung's satisfaction, as he continued to revise and add new material until the demands of his professional life and advancing age made it impossible to continue. Jung kept the Red Book secret for most of his life, sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues and never publishing it during his lifetime. He seemed to regard it as both his most important work and his most dangerous creation, a document that contained insights that were too powerful and too personal to be shared with the general public. The Red Book remained hidden in a bank vault for nearly 50 years after Jung's death, finally being published in 2009 as one of the most significant psychological documents of the 20th century. Part 8. Conversations with Philemon. Among all the mysterious figures that emerged from Jung's unconscious during his work on the Red Book, none was more significant or influential than Philemon, the wise old man with the wings of a kingfisher who became Jung's primary inner guide and teacher. Philemon first appeared to Jung in a dream around 1913. Manifesting as an elderly man with the horns of a bull and the colourful wings of a kingfisher, carrying 4 keys in his hands and possessing an aura of ancient wisdom and spiritual authority. This remarkable figure would become Jung's most important inner companion for the next several years, engaging him in profound philosophical dialogues about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human spiritual development. The conversations with Philemon were not imaginary dialogues, but were experienced by Jung as genuine encounters with an autonomous being who possessed knowledge and insights that transcended his own conscious understanding. Jung's daily dialogue practice with Philemon became a central part of his psychological routine, a disciplined exploration of the unconscious mind that he would continue for many years. Each day, usually in the quiet hours of the evening, Jung would enter a state of active imagination and engage Philemon in conversation about whatever questions or concerns were uppermost in his mind. These dialogues were not casual fantasies, but were approached with the same seriousness and preparation that Jung brought to his scientific research, as he recognized that Philemon represented a source of wisdom that was fundamentally different from his own conscious knowledge. Jung would carefully record these conversations in his journals, preserving not only the content of Philemon's teachings, but also his own emotional reactions and psychological insights that emerged during these encounters. The teachings that Philemon shared with Jung were remarkably sophisticated and often challenged Jung's existing beliefs about psychology, spirituality, and the nature of reality. Philemon emphasized that thoughts and ideas possessed an independent existence that was not created by human consciousness, but was discovered through careful attention to the autonomous processes of the psyche. He taught Jung that the unconscious mind contained not just personal memories and repressed impulses, but also objective psychological realities that existed independently of individual experience. These teachings provided Jung with a theoretical framework for understanding the autonomous nature of complexes and archetypal patterns, concepts that would become central to his analytical psychology. Philemon insisted that psychological healing required not just insight into personal conflicts, but also a recognition of the objective reality of psychic contents and their need to be honored and integrated, rather than simply analyzed and dissolved. The reality of psychic figures like Philemon became a crucial philosophical issue for Jung, as he struggled to understand whether these inner beings were simply projections of his own mind or possessed some form of independent existence. Philemon consistently maintained that he was not a creation of Jung's imagination, but was an autonomous being who existed in the objective realm of the psyche, a dimension of reality that was neither purely subjective nor purely objective in the conventional sense. This perspective challenged Jung's scientific worldview and forced him to develop new concepts about the nature of psychological reality that could account for the apparent independence and wisdom of inner figures like Philemon. Jung eventually concluded that figures like Philemon represented autonomous aspects of the collective unconscious that could manifest as independent personalities within individual consciousness, possessing their own knowledge and perspectives that were not reducible to personal psychology. The conversations with Philemon also provided Jung with crucial insights into the nature of spiritual development and the relationship between psychology and religion. Philemon taught that genuine spiritual growth required a direct personal encounter with the autonomous contents of the unconscious mind, rather than simply accepting the teachings of established religious traditions. He emphasized that each individual must discover their own unique path to psychological wholeness, while also recognizing the universal patterns and archetypal structures that underlie all authentic spiritual development. These teachings influenced Jung's later work on religious psychology and his understanding of the individuation process as a modern form of spiritual development that was adapted to the needs of contemporary consciousness. Philemon's influence on Jung extended far beyond their formal dialogue sessions, as Jung began to experience his presence as a constant companion who could provide guidance and insight during difficult moments in his personal and professional life. Jung would often consult with Philemon about important decisions, seek his advice about challenging patients, and turn to him for comfort and wisdom during periods of uncertainty and stress. This relationship provided Jung with a source of inner stability and confidence that was independent of external validation or professional success, allowing him to pursue his unconventional research interests despite criticism and skepticism from the psychiatric establishment. Philemon became a living symbol of the wise inner guide that Jung believed existed within every individual, waiting to be discovered and consulted through careful attention to the autonomous processes of the unconscious mind. The philosophical implications of Jung's relationship with Philemon were profound and controversial, as they challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between subjective and objective reality. If figures like Philemon possessed genuine autonomy and wisdom that transcended individual psychology, then the unconscious mind might be connected to larger dimensions of reality that were not accessible through ordinary conscious experience. This possibility suggested that psychology might need to expand beyond the study of individual mental processes to include investigation of the objective structures and contents of the collective unconscious. Jung's conversations with Philemon provided him with a personal foundation for these theoretical developments, as he experienced firsthand the reality of autonomous psychic contents that seemed to possess their own knowledge and purposes. The artistic representations of Philemon in the Red Book reflected Jung's attempt to capture the visual and symbolic aspects of his encounters with this mysterious figure. Jung's paintings depicted Philemon as a majestic and otherworldly being, who combined human and animal characteristics in ways that suggested his connection to both earthly and spiritual realms. The wings of the kingfisher, with their brilliant blue and green colours, symbolized Philemon's ability to move between the conscious and unconscious dimensions of experience, while his ancient human features represented the wisdom and knowledge that he possessed. These artistic creations serve not only as records of Jung's visions, but also as active tools for maintaining his connection to Philemon and continuing their ongoing dialogue. The gradual transformation of Jung's relationship with Philemon over the years reflected his own psychological development and his growing understanding of the nature of inner guidance. Initially, Jung experienced Philemon as a completely separate and external figure, who would appear and disappear according to his own mysterious purposes. Over time, however, Jung began to recognize that Philemon represented an aspect of his own deeper personality that was becoming increasingly integrated into his conscious awareness. This integration process did not diminish Philemon's autonomy or wisdom, but rather allowed Jung to access these qualities more directly and consistently in his daily life. The conversations with Philemon eventually evolved into a form of inner dialogue that Jung could engage whenever he needed guidance or insight, representing a successful integration of the autonomous contents of the unconscious mind into the structure of conscious personality. The legacy of Jung's relationship with Philemon extended far beyond his personal psychological development to influence his understanding of the therapeutic process and the goals of analytical psychology. Jung came to believe that successful therapy required not just the resolution of symptoms and conflicts, but also the establishment of a relationship with the inner wisdom figures that exist within every individual's unconscious mind. The conversations with Philemon provided Jung with a model for the kind of inner dialogue that he encouraged his patients to develop, as he recognized that true psychological healing required access to sources of wisdom and guidance that transcended the limitations of ego consciousness. This emphasis on the autonomous wisdom of the unconscious mind became a distinctive feature of Jungian therapy, and continues to influence analytical psychology to this day. Part 9. The Bollingen Tower Mysteries. In 1922, following the death of his mother, Jung purchased a plot of land on the shore of Lake Zurich in the village of Bollingen, where he would spend the next 38 years creating one of the most mysterious and symbolically significant structures in the history of psychology. The Bollingen Tower, as it came to be known, was not built according to conventional architectural plans, but emerged organically from Jung's deep psychological needs and his ongoing dialogue with the unconscious mind. Jung described the building process as a form of active imagination in stone, where each addition and modification reflected his evolving understanding of his own psyche and the universal patterns of human development. The tower became both a physical retreat from the demands of his professional life and a three-dimensional mandala that embodied his most profound insights about the nature of consciousness and the process of individuation. The original structure began as a simple round tower, inspired by Jung's childhood memories of medieval buildings and his deep connection to the symbolism of circular forms. Jung initially envisioned building a primitive one-story dwelling with a hearth in the centre and bunks along the walls, similar to an African hut where the fire serves as the focal point for family life. This design reflected Jung's belief that the round structure represented psychological wholeness and his desire to create a space that would facilitate integration of the various aspects of his personality. However, as construction progressed, Jung found that the building seemed to have its own needs and requirements that went beyond his conscious plans, leading him to add additional sections and towers that reflected the spontaneous demands of his unconscious mind. Each section of the Bollingen Tower was built during a different period of Jung's life and reflected the specific psychological challenges and insights that he was experiencing at that time. The additions in 1927, 1931 and 1935 created a complex structure with 4 interconnected parts that seemed to represent different aspects of Jung's personality and his ongoing process of psychological development. Jung described these additions as responses to concrete needs of the moment, but he later recognized that they had created a meaningful form that served as a symbol of psychic wholeness. The building process itself became a form of meditation and self-exploration, as Jung used his hands to work with stone and wood in ways that connected him directly to the creative forces of the unconscious mind. The most mysterious aspect of the Bollingen Tower was Jung's secret room, a private space that he kept locked and hidden from visitors throughout his life. This room served as Jung's personal sanctuary, where he could retreat from the world and engage in his most intimate psychological work without interruption or observation. The room was filled with alchemical texts, mystical symbols, and personal artifacts that reflected Jung's ongoing exploration of the deepest mysteries of the human psyche. Jung would spend hours in this space, engaged in active imagination, meditation, and the study of esoteric traditions, using the isolation and symbolic richness of the environment to facilitate his encounters with the autonomous contents of the unconscious mind. The room remained sealed after Jung's death, and its contents were never fully revealed to the public, adding to the mystique and speculation surrounding Jung's most private psychological practices. The stone carvings at Bollingen represented Jung's most direct and personal expression of his psychological insights, as he used his own hands to inscribe symbols and messages that captured the essence of his inner experiences. The most famous of these carvings was the Bollingen stone, a cube-shaped monument that Jung created in 1950 to commemorate his 75th birthday. The stone was carved on 3 sides with cryptic inscriptions, alchemical symbols, and images that reflected Jung's understanding of the individuation process and his connection to the archetypal patterns of the collective unconscious. The inscriptions included quotations from alchemy, references to ancient mythology, and personal statements that revealed Jung's understanding of his own role in the broader context of human psychological development. The first side of the Bollingen stone contained a verse that Jung had found in an alchemical text, which spoke of the philosopher's stone as being despised by fools but loved by the wise. This inscription reflected Jung's understanding of his own psychological work as a modern form of alchemy, where the goal was not the transformation of base metals into gold, but the transformation of unconscious contents into conscious wisdom. The second side featured a complex mandala design with the figure of Telesphorus, a child god from Greek mythology who was associated with healing and the guidance of souls between worlds. This image represented Jung's understanding of the healing power of the unconscious mind and the importance of maintaining connection to the archetypal patterns that guide psychological development. The third side, which faced the lake, contained a Latin inscription that described the orphan nature of the philosopher's stone and its presence in all things, reflecting Jung's understanding of the self-archetype as the central organizing principle of the psyche. The construction work at Bollingen was always done by Jung's own hands, as he insisted on maintaining direct physical contact with the materials and the building process. He would spend hours each day working with stone, wood and metal, using these activities as a form of active meditation that connected him to the creative forces of the unconscious mind. Jung found that the physical work helped him to integrate psychological insights in ways that purely intellectual understanding could not achieve, as the repetitive motions of building and carving created a meditative state that facilitated the emergence of unconscious contents. The building process also served as a form of play that allowed Jung to express aspects of his personality that were not fully engaged in his professional work, reconnecting him to the creative and spontaneous aspects of his nature. The symbolic significance of the Bollingen Tower extended far beyond its function as a personal retreat, as Jung came to understand it as a concrete expression of the individuation process that could serve as a model for others seeking psychological wholeness. The tower's organic growth from a simple round structure to a complex multi-part building reflected the natural development of the psyche from unconscious unity to conscious differentiation and eventual integration. Each addition to the building represented a different stage of psychological development, while the overall structure maintained its essential unity and coherence. Jung saw the tower as a living symbol of the self-archetype, demonstrating how individual psychological development could create structures that were both personally meaningful and universally significant. The daily life at Bollingen was deliberately primitive and simple, as Jung chose to live without electricity or modern conveniences in order to maintain connection to more fundamental aspects of human experience. He would cook his meals over an open fire, draw water from a well, and spend his time in activities that connected him directly to the natural world and the archetypal patterns of human existence. This lifestyle was not an escape from modernity, but rather a deliberate choice to maintain contact with the psychological roots of human experience that Jung believed were essential for psychological health and development. The simplicity of life at Bollingen allowed Jung to focus entirely on his inner work, without the distractions and complications of modern professional life, creating conditions that were optimal for the emergence and integration of unconscious contents. The tower served as a bridge between the ancient world of symbols and archetypes and the modern world of psychological understanding, demonstrating how traditional wisdom could be integrated with contemporary insights to create a more complete understanding of human nature and potential. Part 10. The Mescaline Consideration. During the 1920s and 30s, as reports of mescaline's mind-altering effects began to circulate in scientific and literary circles, Carl Jung found himself at the center of a fascinating debate about the nature of consciousness and the methods for exploring the depths of the human psyche. Despite his lifelong fascination with altered states of consciousness and his extensive exploration of visionary experiences through active imagination, Jung made the deliberate and controversial decision to refuse all opportunities to experiment with mescaline and other psychedelic substances. This refusal was not based on moral objections or fear of legal consequences, but rather on Jung's carefully considered understanding of the fundamental differences between naturally occurring psychological experiences and artificially induced altered states. His position on mescaline revealed crucial insights into his understanding of the unconscious mind and the proper methods for accessing its contents safely and meaningfully. Jung's reasons for refusing mescaline were complex and reflected his deep understanding of the psychological principles that governed the emergence of unconscious contents. He believed that the visions and insights that emerged through active imagination were fundamentally different from those produced by chemical means, because natural psychological experiences arose from the autonomous activity of the unconscious mind in response to genuine psychological needs and developmental processes. Mescaline-induced visions, by contrast, were artificially triggered and might not reflect the individual's actual psychological state or developmental requirements. Jung feared that relying on chemical substances to access the unconscious might actually interfere with the natural processes of psychological development and prevent individuals from developing the skills and insights necessary for genuine integration of unconscious contents. The fundamental concern underlying Jung's rejection of mescaline was his belief that psychological development required the ego to maintain conscious participation in the process of encountering unconscious material. During natural visionary experiences achieved through active imagination, the conscious mind remained actively engaged in dialogue with unconscious contents, asking questions, seeking clarification, and gradually integrating new insights into existing psychological structures. Chemical substances, however, might overwhelm the ego's capacity to maintain conscious participation, creating experiences that were more like passive dreams than active psychological work. Jung was concerned that individuals who relied on mescaline might become dependent on external chemical triggers, rather than developing their own natural capacity for accessing and integrating unconscious wisdom. This dependence could actually retard psychological development by preventing individuals from learning the skills necessary for ongoing dialogue with their unconscious minds. Jung's fears about mescaline were also related to his understanding of the potentially dangerous nature of unconscious contents and the importance of approaching them with proper preparation and psychological stability. He had experienced firsthand the psychological risks involved in deep exploration of the unconscious during his work on the Red Book, and he understood that encountering powerful archetypal material required considerable ego strength and psychological maturity. Chemical substances might allow individuals to access unconscious contents before they were psychologically ready to integrate them, potentially leading to psychological destabilization or even psychotic episodes. Jung believed that the natural barriers that prevented easy access to unconscious material existed for good psychological reasons, and that bypassing these barriers through chemical means could be psychologically dangerous for unprepared individuals. The correspondence between Jung and various researchers and intellectuals about mescaline revealed the depth of his thinking about the nature of consciousness and the proper methods for psychological exploration. When approached by colleagues who were experimenting with mescaline and other psychedelic substances, Jung would carefully explain his theoretical objections while remaining respectful of their research interests. He was particularly concerned about the tendency of some researchers to treat mescaline experiences as spiritual revelations rather than psychological phenomena that required careful analysis and integration. Jung emphasized that even the most profound visionary experiences were meaningful only to the extent that they could be integrated into the individual's ongoing psychological development and translated into practical wisdom for daily life. Without this integration process, even the most spectacular chemical-induced visions might remain isolated psychological events that contributed little to genuine psychological growth. Jung's alternative approach to exploring altered states of consciousness through active imagination was based on his understanding of the natural rhythms and requirements of psychological development. He believed that the unconscious mind would spontaneously produce the visions and insights that individuals needed for their psychological growth, but only when they were ready to receive and integrate this material constructively. Active imagination required patience, discipline, and the gradual development of the capacity to maintain conscious dialogue with unconscious contents, skills that Jung believed were essential for psychological maturity. This natural approach to accessing the unconscious was slower and more demanding than chemical methods, but Jung argued that it produced more stable and meaningful results because it was based on the individual's actual psychological needs and developmental capacity. The broader philosophical implications of Jung's position on mescaline reflected his understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious mind. He believed that consciousness and the unconscious existed in a dynamic relationship that required careful balance and mutual respect, with neither aspect of the psyche being allowed to dominate the other. Chemical substances might disrupt this natural balance by giving the unconscious temporary dominance over consciousness, creating experiences that were more like passive dreams than active psychological work. Jung's approach emphasized the importance of maintaining conscious participation in all encounters with unconscious material, ensuring that the ego remained strong enough to serve as a reliable partner in the ongoing dialogue between conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. This balance was essential for psychological health and for the successful integration of unconscious insights into conscious life. Jung's refusal to experiment with mescaline also reflected his understanding of the importance of suffering and struggle in psychological development. He believed that the difficulties and challenges involved in accessing unconscious material through natural methods were not obstacles to be overcome, but were essential aspects of the developmental process itself. The patience and discipline required for active imagination, the courage needed to face disturbing unconscious contents, and the intellectual effort required to integrate visionary experiences into conscious understanding were all crucial components of psychological growth. Chemical shortcuts might allow individuals to bypass these essential developmental challenges, but Jung argued that this would ultimately result in less stable and meaningful psychological transformation. The long-term vindication of Jung's position on mescaline and other psychedelic substances has been supported by subsequent research into the psychological effects of these chemicals. While psychedelic experiences can indeed produce profound psychological insights and therapeutic benefits, researchers have found that the most meaningful and lasting effects occur when these experiences are carefully prepared for, professionally guided, and followed by extensive integration work. Jung's emphasis on the importance of conscious participation, proper preparation, and careful integration of altered state experiences has been validated by modern psychedelic research, which has shown that the most beneficial effects occur when individuals approach these experiences with the same respect and discipline that Jung brought to his work with active imagination. His refusal to experiment with mescaline was not based on narrow-minded conservatism, but on a sophisticated understanding of the psychological principles that govern healthy encounters with unconscious material, principles that remain relevant for anyone seeking to explore the deeper mysteries of human consciousness. Part 11. The I Ching Experiments. For over 30 years, Carl Jung conducted one of the most systematic and extensive investigations into the nature of synchronicity ever undertaken by a Western scientist. using the ancient Chinese divination system known as the I Ching as his primary research tool. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing until his death in 1961, Jung performed thousands of I Ching consultations, meticulously recording the results and attempting to develop statistical methods for analyzing the meaningful connections between the oracle's responses and the psychological states of the people who consulted it. This massive experiment represented Jung's most ambitious attempt to prove the existence of synchronicity, the principle he defined as meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by conventional cause and effect relationships. The I Ching experiments would ultimately lead to some of Jung's most controversial theoretical claims, and would establish him as one of the few Western scientists willing to seriously investigate the reality of a causal connecting principles in nature. Jung's introduction to the I Ching came through his friendship with the German sinologist Richard Wilhelm, who had spent decades in China studying Taoist philosophy and had produced what many considered the definitive German translation of the ancient text. Wilhelm's approach to the I Ching was not merely academic, but was based on his personal experience of using the oracle as a practical tool for understanding psychological and spiritual development. When Wilhelm shared his translation with Jung in the early 1920s, Jung was immediately fascinated by the sophisticated psychological insights contained in the text, and by the claims that the oracle could provide meaningful guidance for important life decisions. Jung began experimenting with the I Ching as both a research tool and a personal practice, approaching it with the same methodical precision that he brought to his psychological research, while remaining open to the possibility that it might reveal aspects of reality that were not accessible through conventional scientific methods. The daily practice of consulting the I Ching became an integral part of Jung's psychological routine, as he would use the oracle to gain insights into his own psychological state, to understand the dynamics of his relationships with patients and colleagues, and to explore the deeper meanings of significant events in his life. Jung's method involved the traditional approach of throwing 3 coins 6 times to generate hexagrams, which he would then interpret using Wilhelm's translation and his own growing understanding of Chinese philosophical principles. He found that the oracle seemed to have an uncanny ability to provide responses that were precisely relevant to his psychological situation, even when the questions he posed were vague, or when he approached the consultation with skepticism about its potential usefulness. This consistent relevance convinced Jung that the I Ching was not operating through chance alone, but was somehow connected to the meaningful patterns that underlay both psychological and physical events. Jung's attempts to develop statistical methods for analyzing I Ching responses represented one of the most ambitious efforts ever undertaken to apply scientific methodology to the study of divination systems. He carefully recorded thousands of consultations, noting the hexagrams that appeared, the questions that were asked, the psychological circumstances of the consultants, and the subsequent events that seemed to validate or contradict the oracle's responses. Jung was looking for patterns that would demonstrate that certain hexagrams appeared more frequently than chance would predict under specific psychological conditions, or that the oracle's responses showed statistical correlations with later events in ways that could not be explained by random coincidence. While Jung never achieved the kind of definitive statistical proof that he hoped for, his research did reveal intriguing patterns that suggested the existence of subtle correlations between inner psychological states and the apparently random process of coin-throwing. The theoretical framework that Jung developed to explain the I Ching's effectiveness was based on his concept of synchronicity, which he defined as the simultaneous occurrence of psychologically meaningful events that were connected not by causation, but by meaning. According to Jung's theory, the moment when someone consulted the I Ching represented a unique configuration of psychological and physical factors that was reflected both in the person's inner state and in the pattern of the hexagram that emerged from the coin-throwing process. This connection was not mediated by any physical cause and effect relationship, but occurred through what Jung called an acausal connecting principle that operated according to the laws of meaning rather than the laws of physics. The I Ching worked, according to this theory, because it provided a symbolic language for interpreting the meaningful patterns that were already present in the psychological and physical situation of the consultant. The oracle did not predict the future or provide information from external sources, but rather revealed the hidden meanings and potentials that were inherent in the present moment. Jung's evidence for synchronicity extended far beyond his I Ching experiments to include thousands of documented cases of meaningful coincidences that he had observed in his clinical practice and personal life. He collected stories of patients who had dreams that accurately predicted future events, instances where random events seemed to mirror the psychological states of the people who experienced them, and cases where symbolic objects or images appeared in people's lives at precisely the moments when they needed to understand their deeper meanings. The I Ching served as a controlled experimental method for studying these phenomena, allowing Jung to create conditions where synchronistic events could be observed and analyzed under relatively systematic circumstances. While critics argued that Jung was simply noticing patterns that were created by his own psychological projections, Jung maintained that the consistency and specificity of the correlations he observed could not be explained by subjective bias alone. He believed that his research provided evidence for a fundamental principle of nature that had been overlooked by conventional science because of its exclusive focus on causal relationships. The famous foreword that Jung wrote for Wilhelm's English translation of the I Ching became one of the most controversial pieces of writing in Jung's entire career, as it represented his most public endorsement of ideas that many of his scientific colleagues considered to be superstitious nonsense. In the foreword, Jung explained his theory of synchronicity and described his own experiences with the I Ching in terms that seemed to endorse the reality of divinatory practices that had been rejected by Western science for centuries. The publication of this foreword in 1950 generated intense criticism from the scientific community, with many of Jung's colleagues expressing concern that he was damaging his professional reputation by associating himself with what they considered to be primitive magical thinking. Jung defended his position by arguing that science needed to expand its methods and theoretical frameworks to include phenomena that were meaningful but not necessarily causal, and that the I Ching represented a sophisticated approach to understanding reality that could complement rather than contradict scientific knowledge. The practical applications of Jung's I Ching research extended into his therapeutic work, as he began using the oracle as a tool for helping patients understand their psychological situations and explore their unconscious motivations. Jung found that patients often responded more openly to insights that emerged through I Ching consultations than to interpretations that were presented through conventional analytical methods, perhaps because the oracle seemed to provide a neutral and objective source of wisdom that was not contaminated by the therapist's personal opinions or theoretical biases. The symbolic language of the I Ching also provided a rich vocabulary for discussing psychological states and developmental processes that were difficult to express through ordinary psychological terminology. Jung was careful to present the I Ching as a psychological tool rather than as a supernatural oracle, emphasizing that its value lay in its ability to stimulate self-reflection and reveal unconscious patterns rather than in any ability to predict future events or provide information from external sources. The philosophical implications of Jung's I Ching experiments were profound, as they suggested that reality might be organized according to principles of meaning and pattern that were not reducible to mechanical cause and effect relationships. If synchronicity was indeed a real phenomenon, then the universe might have a psychological as well as a physical dimension, with events being connected not only by chains of causation, but also by networks of meaning that reflected the archetypal patterns of the collective unconscious. This possibility suggested that divination systems like the I Ching might be sophisticated technologies for accessing information about these meaningful patterns, providing insights into the hidden order that underlies both psychological and physical events. Jung's research raised fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge and the methods that might be needed to understand reality in its fullest complexity, suggesting that purely objective and analytical approaches might need to be supplemented by more intuitive and participatory methods of investigation. The legacy of Jung's I Ching experiments continues to influence contemporary discussions about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between mind and reality. While mainstream science has not accepted Jung's claims about synchronicity, research in quantum physics and complexity theory has revealed phenomena that seem to support some aspects of his theoretical framework, including non-local correlations between distant events and the emergence of meaningful patterns from apparently random processes. Modern chaos theory and systems thinking have also provided new conceptual tools for understanding how meaningful patterns can emerge from complex interactions without requiring traditional cause and effect explanations. Jung's I Ching research remains one of the most systematic attempts ever undertaken to study the relationship between consciousness and reality, using methods that honor both the precision of scientific investigation and the meaningful patterns that seem to connect psychological and physical events in ways that transcend conventional understanding. Part 12. OSS and CIA Connections. During World War II and throughout the early years of the Cold War, Carl Jung became involved in one of the most secret and controversial aspects of his career, serving as a psychological consultant to American intelligence agencies in their efforts to understand the minds of world leaders and develop new methods for psychological warfare. Jung's work as Agent 488 for the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, began in 1943 when American intelligence officers recognized that his expertise in psychological analysis could provide crucial insights into the personalities and motivations of enemy leaders. This clandestine relationship would continue for over a decade, involving Jung in secret research projects that explored the psychological dimensions of political power, the dynamics of mass movements, and the potential applications of depth psychology to intelligence gathering and psychological operations. The full extent of Jung's involvement with American intelligence services remained classified for decades, and even today many details of his work remain hidden in government archives that have never been fully disclosed to the public. Jung's most significant contribution to the Allied war effort was his psychological analysis of Adolf Hitler, a comprehensive study that attempted to understand the Nazi leader's personality structure, his psychological appeal to the German people, and his likely behavior under various military and political pressures. Working from photographs, newsreel footage, and detailed reports about Hitler's behavior and speeches, Jung developed a psychological profile that portrayed the Nazi leader as a man possessed by archetypal forces that he neither understood nor controlled. Jung's analysis suggested that Hitler had become a vessel for the dark shadow aspects of the German collective unconscious, embodying the repressed aggression and grandiose fantasies that had been building in German culture since the humiliation of World War I. This analysis provided American intelligence officials with insights into Hitler's psychological vulnerabilities, and helped them understand the deeper psychological forces that were driving the Nazi movement beyond simple political and economic explanations. The psychological profiles that Jung created for American intelligence went far beyond conventional character assessments to explore the archetypal dimensions of political leadership and the unconscious forces that shaped the behavior of world leaders. Jung analyzed not only Hitler, but also other key figures in the Nazi hierarchy, as well as Japanese leaders and Soviet officials, looking for psychological patterns that could help American strategists predict their behavior and develop effective countermeasures. These profiles incorporated Jung's understanding of complexes, archetypes, and the collective unconscious to create multidimensional portraits that revealed the hidden psychological dynamics behind political decision-making. Jung's approach was revolutionary because it treated political leaders not simply as rational actors pursuing clear objectives, but as human beings whose behavior was shaped by unconscious forces, personal complexes, and archetypal patterns that could be analyzed and predicted using depth psychological methods. The secret government consultations that Jung provided during this period extended beyond individual psychological assessments to include broader analyses of social and political movements that were shaping the post-war world. American intelligence officials were particularly interested in Jung's insights into the psychology of mass movements, including communism, fascism, and the emerging patterns of decolonization that were transforming the global political landscape. Jung's analysis of these movements emphasized the archetypal and mythological dimensions of political ideologies, showing how they appealed to deep psychological needs and fears that went far beyond rational political and economic considerations. His work helped American policymakers understand that the Cold War was not simply a geopolitical struggle, but was also a psychological conflict between different visions of human nature and social organization that tapped into fundamental archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious. Jung's post-war intelligence work included participation in secret research projects that explored the potential applications of psychological warfare and the development of methods for influencing public opinion and political behavior through psychological means. While the details of these projects remain largely classified, it is known that Jung was consulted about the psychological effects of propaganda, the dynamics of political indoctrination, and the methods that could be used to counter the psychological influence of communist and other totalitarian ideologies. This work represented a controversial expansion of Jung's psychological expertise into the realm of political manipulation and social control, raising ethical questions about the appropriate uses of depth psychological insights and the responsibilities of psychologists in relation to government power. Jung's involvement in these projects reflected both his genuine concern about the totalitarian threats to individual freedom and his belief that psychological knowledge could be used to defend democratic values against ideological extremism. The relationship between Jung and American intelligence services was complicated by his Swiss neutrality and his complex attitudes toward the various political forces that were shaping the 20th century. While Jung was clearly opposed to Nazi totalitarianism and provided valuable assistance to the Allied cause, he was also critical of certain aspects of American foreign policy and concerned about the psychological dangers of any form of mass political movement, including democratic ones. Jung's political views were shaped by his understanding of the archetypal forces that drove human behavior, leading him to be suspicious of any ideology that claimed to have simple solutions to complex human problems. This independence of thought sometimes put him at odds with his intelligence contacts, who were looking for psychological insights that would support particular policy objectives, rather than the kind of complex and nuanced analysis that Jung preferred to provide. The ethical implications of Jung's intelligence work became a source of ongoing controversy among his followers and critics, as many questioned whether it was appropriate for a therapist and humanitarian to be involved in secret government operations that might involve psychological manipulation and political interference. Jung defended his involvement by arguing that the totalitarian threats of the 20th century required new forms of resistance that went beyond conventional military and political responses to include psychological and cultural dimensions. He believed that depth psychology could provide essential insights into the nature of political evil and the methods needed to defend human freedom and dignity against ideological extremism. However, critics argued that Jung's involvement with intelligence agencies compromised his independence as a scholar and therapist, and potentially contributed to the development of psychological techniques that could be used for ethically questionable purposes. The debate over Jung's intelligence work reflects broader questions about the relationship between psychological knowledge and political power that continue to be relevant for contemporary discussions about the ethics of psychological research and practice. The influence of Jung's intelligence work on his theoretical development was significant, as his analysis of political leaders and mass movements contributed to his understanding of the collective unconscious and the archetypal forces that shape human behavior on a social and cultural level. His observations of how archetypal patterns manifested in political ideologies and leadership styles provided empirical support for his theories about the universal structures of the human psyche and their influence on historical and cultural development. The intelligence work also deepened Jung's understanding of the shadow aspects of human nature and the ways in which repressed psychological contents could emerge in destructive forms when they were not properly integrated into conscious awareness. These insights contributed to Jung's later writings on social and political psychology and influenced his understanding of the psychological dimensions of historical change and cultural transformation. The long-term impact of Jung's intelligence work on the development of psychological warfare and political psychology techniques used by government agencies remains a subject of ongoing research and speculation. While many details of Jung's contributions remain classified, it is clear that his insights into the psychological dimensions of political behavior influenced the development of propaganda analysis, psychological operations, and other intelligence techniques that became standard tools of Cold War competition. The application of depth psychological principles to intelligence work represented a significant expansion of the scope and influence of Jungian psychology, though it also raised important questions about the ethical boundaries of psychological expertise and the potential misuse of insights into human nature for political purposes. Jung's intelligence work serves as a reminder that psychological knowledge is never politically neutral, and that the insights of depth psychology can be applied for both constructive and potentially harmful purposes, depending on the values and objectives of those who use them. Part 13. The Pauli Effect Studies. One of the most extraordinary and scientifically challenging collaborations in Carl Jung's career was his 26-year friendship and research partnership with Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who suffered from a mysterious psychological condition that caused laboratory equipment to malfunction in his presence. This phenomenon, which became known throughout the scientific community as the Pauli effect, involved the spontaneous breakdown of delicate experimental apparatus whenever Pauli entered a laboratory, leading to explosions, electrical failures, and the destruction of expensive equipment that had been functioning perfectly moments before his arrival. The collaboration between Jung and Pauli represented an unprecedented attempt to bridge the gap between physics and psychology, exploring the possibility that consciousness and physical reality were connected through principles that transcended the conventional boundaries between mind and matter. Their joint research into synchronicity, quantum mechanics, and the psychological dimensions of scientific discovery would produce some of the most innovative and controversial ideas in 20th century science. The Pauli effect first came to scientific attention during Pauli's early career at the University of Göttingen, where his mere presence in the laboratory of experimental physicist James Franck caused a complex and expensive piece of equipment to explode without any apparent physical cause. Similar incidents occurred throughout Pauli's career with such regularity that many laboratories refused to allow him to visit, and experimental physicists would joke nervously about the mysterious power that seemed to emanate from the brilliant theoretical physicist. Pauli himself was deeply troubled by these occurrences, recognizing that they suggested some kind of connection between his psychological state and the behavior of physical systems that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of scientific objectivity and the separation between observer and observed phenomena. The incidents seemed to occur most frequently during periods of psychological stress, or when Pauli was wrestling with particularly difficult theoretical problems, suggesting that the effect might be related to unconscious psychological processes rather than to any conscious intention or paranormal ability. Jung's initial encounter with Pauli occurred in 1932, when the physicist sought psychological help for the personal and professional crises that were plaguing his life during this period. Pauli was struggling with depression, relationship difficulties, and a sense of alienation from his scientific work that had led him to question the fundamental assumptions of physics and his own role as a scientist. Jung recognized that Pauli's psychological problems were intimately connected to his scientific work, and that the physicist's unconscious mind contained insights about the nature of reality that could contribute to Jung's own understanding of the relationship between psyche and matter. The therapeutic relationship quickly evolved into a research collaboration, as both men realized that their respective expertise in psychology and physics could be combined to explore questions about consciousness and reality that neither could address working alone. The systematic documentation of Pauli effect incidents that Jung and Pauli undertook revealed patterns that suggested the phenomenon was related to the activation of archetypal contents in Pauli's unconscious mind. Jung observed that the equipment failures seemed to occur most frequently when Pauli was unconsciously wrestling with scientific problems that had archetypal dimensions, particularly those involving the reconciliation of opposing principles or the discovery of hidden unifying patterns in nature. The breakdowns often involved sophisticated measuring devices and precision instruments that were designed to detect subtle physical phenomena, suggesting that Pauli's unconscious mind was somehow interfering with the delicate balance of forces that these instruments required to function properly. Jung hypothesized that the effect represented a manifestation of synchronicity on the level of physical systems, where Pauli's psychological state was creating meaningful correlations with material events through a causal connecting principles that operated outside the normal framework of cause and effect relationships. The theoretical implications of the Pauli effect for understanding the relationship between consciousness and physical reality were profound and controversial. If Pauli's psychological state could indeed influence the behavior of laboratory equipment through non-physical means, then the fundamental assumptions of scientific materialism were called into question, and new theoretical frameworks would be needed to account for the apparent interaction between mind and matter. Jung and Pauli explored the possibility that consciousness and physical reality were both expressions of a deeper, underlying unity that could be understood through the emerging principles of quantum mechanics and depth psychology. They were particularly interested in the parallels between the observer effect in quantum physics, where the act of measurement influences the behavior of subatomic particles, and the psychological phenomena that Jung had observed in his clinical work, where the therapist's consciousness seemed to participate in the patient's healing process in ways that transcended conventional causal explanations. The research collaboration between Jung and Pauli produced a series of papers and letters that explored the connections between archetypal psychology and quantum physics, attempting to develop a unified understanding of reality that could account for both psychological and physical phenomena. They were particularly interested in the concept of complementarity that Niels Bohr had developed to explain the wave-particle duality of quantum systems, seeing it as a model for understanding how consciousness and matter could be understood as complementary aspects of a single underlying reality. Jung's concept of synchronicity provided a psychological counterpart to the non-local correlations that quantum physics had discovered between distant particles, suggesting that meaningful connections could exist between events that were not linked by conventional causal relationships. The collaboration represented an ambitious attempt to create a new scientific paradigm that could integrate the insights of depth psychology with the discoveries of modern physics, though the theoretical framework they developed remained largely speculative and was not accepted by mainstream science. The personal relationship between Jung and Pauli was marked by mutual respect and intellectual excitement, but also by the tensions that inevitably arose from their different professional backgrounds and methodological approaches. Pauli was trained in the rigorous mathematical methods of theoretical physics and was sometimes frustrated by Jung's more intuitive and symbolic approach to understanding reality, while Jung was occasionally impatient with Pauli's demand for precise quantitative formulations of psychological phenomena that Jung believed were inherently qualitative and meaningful rather than measurable. Despite these differences, both men recognized that their collaboration was opening up new territories of knowledge that neither could explore alone, and they maintained their research partnership until Pauli's death in 1958. The hundreds of letters they exchanged during their collaboration provide a fascinating record of two brilliant minds attempting to bridge the gap between scientific materialism and psychological insight, exploring questions about the nature of reality that remain relevant for contemporary discussions about consciousness and quantum physics. The Pauli effect continued throughout the physicist's career, with well-documented incidents occurring even after his collaboration with Jung had provided him with psychological insights into the phenomenon. The effect seemed to be an autonomous aspect of Pauli's personality that operated independently of his conscious understanding or attempts to control it, suggesting that it represented a genuine psychosomatic phenomenon rather than a product of suggestion or psychological projection. The incidents were witnessed by numerous colleagues and were often photographed or otherwise documented, providing objective evidence for the reality of the phenomenon that could not be dismissed as subjective interpretation or wishful thinking. The Pauli effect remains one of the most intriguing examples of apparent psychokinetic phenomena ever documented in a scientific context, and it continues to challenge conventional assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The legacy of the Jung-Pauli collaboration extends far beyond their specific research findings to encompass broader questions about the nature of scientific knowledge and the methods that might be needed to understand reality in its fullest complexity. Their work anticipated many of the questions that contemporary physicists and consciousness researchers are exploring about the role of observation in quantum mechanics, the nature of information in physical systems, and the possibility that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex material systems. The collaboration also demonstrated the potential value of interdisciplinary research that brings together insights from different fields of knowledge, showing how psychological and physical perspectives can illuminate aspects of reality that neither approach could reveal working alone. The Jung-Pauli partnership remains a model for the kind of innovative and boundary-crossing research that may be needed to address the fundamental questions about consciousness and reality that continue to challenge both science and psychology in the 21st century. Part 14. The UFO Investigation. Carl Jung's investigation into the UFO phenomenon, conducted over more than a decade from the late 1940s until his death in 1961, represented one of the most systematic psychological studies of a mass cultural phenomenon ever undertaken by a major scientific figure. Jung's interest in what he called flying saucers was sparked not by a belief in extraterrestrial visitation, but by his recognition that the sudden surge of UFO sightings following World War II represented a powerful manifestation of archetypal material emerging from the collective unconscious in response to the unprecedented anxieties of the nuclear age. His research into UFO reports collected from around the world and analysed using the methods of analytical psychology would culminate in his controversial book Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies, which presented a psychological interpretation of the UFO phenomenon that challenged both believers and skeptics. Jung's UFO investigation demonstrated his willingness to apply psychological analysis to contemporary cultural phenomena and revealed his understanding of how archetypal patterns could manifest in collective experiences during periods of historical crisis and transformation. Jung's collection of UFO reports began in 1947, shortly after the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting that launched the modern era of flying saucer reports, and continued throughout the 1950s as the phenomenon gained international attention and government interest. Jung gathered accounts from pilots, military personnel, radar operators, and other credible witnesses whose professional training and psychological stability made their reports particularly valuable for psychological analysis. He was less interested in determining the physical reality of UFO sightings than in understanding their psychological significance and the patterns of meaning that they revealed about the collective state of mind in the post-war world. Jung's approach to the UFO phenomenon was unique because he took the reports seriously as psychological documents while remaining agnostic about their physical reality, focusing on what the sightings revealed about the unconscious needs and fears of the people who experienced them. The psychological versus physical reality debate that surrounded Jung's UFO research reflected his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality. Jung argued that even if UFO sightings were entirely psychological phenomena, they were no less real or significant than physical events because they revealed important truths about the collective psychological state of humanity during a critical period of historical transformation. He was particularly interested in the possibility that some UFO sightings might represent synchronistic events where psychological needs and physical phenomena coincided in meaningful ways that could not be explained through conventional causal relationships. This perspective allowed Jung to investigate the UFO phenomenon without having to resolve the question of whether the sightings represented visits from extraterrestrial beings, psychological projections, or some combination of both physical and psychological factors. Jung's approach demonstrated his understanding that the most important aspects of human experience often involve the intersection of subjective and objective reality rather than purely physical or purely psychological phenomena. Jung's analysis of UFO reports revealed striking patterns that supported his theory that the sightings represented manifestations of archetypal material related to the mandala symbol and the psychological need for wholeness and integration. The circular or disc-shaped form that characterized most UFO sightings corresponded to the mandala patterns that Jung had observed in the dreams and artwork of his patients during periods of psychological crisis and transformation. Jung interpreted the UFO phenomenon as a collective projection of the self-archetype, appearing in the sky at a time when humanity was facing unprecedented threats to its survival and needed symbols of transcendent unity and hope. The reports often described UFOs as luminous, perfectly formed objects that moved with purposeful intelligence, characteristics that Jung recognized as typical of archetypal symbols that represent the integrated and harmonious aspects of the psyche. The fact that these symbols were appearing in the external world, rather than in individual dreams and fantasies, suggested that the psychological crisis of the nuclear age had activated archetypal responses on a collective level that transcended individual consciousness. The mandala symbolism that Jung identified in UFO sightings was particularly significant because it appeared across different cultures and geographical regions, suggesting that the phenomenon represented universal psychological patterns rather than culturally specific beliefs or expectations. Jung collected reports from countries around the world and found that the basic characteristics of UFO sightings remained remarkably consistent despite significant differences in cultural background, religious beliefs, and scientific education among the witnesses. This consistency suggested that the UFO phenomenon was tapping into archetypal patterns that existed in the collective unconscious of all humanity rather than being shaped by particular cultural traditions or belief systems. Jung's cross-cultural analysis of UFO reports provided additional evidence for his theory of the collective unconscious and demonstrated how archetypal material could manifest simultaneously across different populations during periods of collective crisis. Jung's research into government attitudes toward UFO phenomena revealed what he interpreted as official ambivalence that reflected the broader cultural anxiety about the implications of the sightings. While government agencies publicly dismissed most UFO reports as misidentifications or hoaxes, Jung observed that they were simultaneously conducting secret investigations and treating the phenomenon as a potential national security issue. Jung interpreted this contradictory response as evidence that government officials were unconsciously recognizing the psychological significance of the UFO phenomenon, even while consciously denying its importance. The secrecy surrounding official UFO investigations served to increase public anxiety and speculation, creating a feedback loop that amplified the psychological impact of the phenomenon and contributed to its cultural significance. Jung's analysis of government behavior provided insights into how institutional responses to archetypal phenomena could either facilitate or complicate the psychological processing of collective unconscious material. The claims of government consultation that surrounded Jung's UFO research reflected the broader context of his intelligence work during the Cold War period, though the specific details of any official involvement in UFO investigations remain largely classified. Jung's reputation as an expert in mass psychology and his experience analyzing political and social movements made him a valuable consultant for government agencies trying to understand the psychological dimensions of the UFO phenomenon and its potential impact on public morale and national security. While Jung never publicly confirmed the extent of his official involvement in UFO research, his writings suggest that he had access to classified information about government investigations and that his psychological analysis was informed by more comprehensive data than was available to civilian researchers. The intersection of Jung's UFO research with his intelligence work demonstrated how archetypal phenomena could become entangled with political and security concerns in ways that complicated both psychological analysis and public understanding of the phenomenon. Jung's interpretation of the UFO phenomenon as a modern myth reflected his understanding of how archetypal patterns adapt to contemporary cultural contexts while maintaining their essential psychological functions. Just as ancient myths provided symbolic frameworks for understanding existential questions and collective challenges, Jung argued that UFO sightings were creating a new mythology that addressed the specific anxieties and needs of the nuclear age. The image of wise and technologically advanced beings arriving from other worlds provided a contemporary version of the savior archetype, offering hope that humanity's problems could be solved through contact with superior intelligence and technology. At the same time, the mysterious and potentially threatening nature of UFO encounters reflected collective fears about the loss of human agency and control in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. Jung's analysis showed how the UFO phenomenon served both hopeful and fearful psychological functions, providing a symbolic language for processing the contradictory emotions that characterize the human condition in the atomic age. The long-term influence of Jung's UFO research extended far beyond his specific conclusions about the phenomenon to encompass broader questions about the psychological dimensions of cultural change and the role of archetypal symbolism in collective adaptation to historical crises. Jung's approach to UFO phenomena demonstrated how psychological analysis could illuminate the deeper meanings of contemporary cultural movements and provide insights into the unconscious processes that shape collective behavior during periods of social transformation. His work anticipated many of the themes that would become central to the study of popular culture and mass media, showing how archetypal patterns could manifest through technological imagery and scientific concepts, rather than traditional religious or mythological symbols. Jung's UFO investigation remains relevant for contemporary discussions about how collective, unconscious material adapts to new cultural contexts and how psychological analysis can contribute to understanding the deeper meanings of phenomena that appear to be purely technological or scientific in nature. Part 15. Dream Telepathy Experiments. Throughout his career, Carl Jung systematically documented and analyzed hundreds of cases involving apparent telepathic communication through dreams, creating one of the most comprehensive collections of evidence for psychic phenomena ever assembled by a major psychological researcher. Jung's investigation into dream telepathy began during his early work at the Burgholzli Hospital, where he noticed that patients would sometimes report dreams that seemed to contain accurate information about events occurring in the lives of people they had no normal contact with, including family members in distant locations and even strangers whose experiences seemed to parallel their own psychological situations. These observations led Jung to develop systematic methods for documenting and analyzing telepathic dreams, including careful verification of the factual accuracy of dream content and investigation of the psychological connections between dreamers and the people or events that appeared in their nocturnal visions. Jung's dream telepathy research represented one of his most controversial scientific endeavors, as it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between individual minds. The shared dreams that Jung documented between patients and therapists provided some of the most compelling evidence for telepathic communication that he encountered in his research. Jung observed that patients would sometimes report dreams that contained accurate details about his own life experiences, emotional states, or future plans that they had no normal way of knowing about. Conversely, Jung found that he would sometimes dream about patients' experiences or psychological conflicts before these issues were revealed in therapy sessions, suggesting that unconscious communication was occurring between therapist and patient through channels that transcended normal sensory perception. These therapeutic telepathic experiences were particularly significant because they occurred within the context of intense psychological relationships where both participants were focused on understanding unconscious processes, creating conditions that seemed to facilitate the emergence of psychic phenomena. Jung's documentation of these experiences provided evidence that the therapeutic relationship might involve forms of unconscious communication that went far beyond the verbal and behavioral interactions that were acknowledged by conventional psychological theory. Jung's collection of predictive dreams represented another major category of evidence for telepathic or clairvoyant abilities that seemed to operate through the unconscious mind during sleep states. He gathered hundreds of accounts from patients, colleagues, and correspondents who reported dreams that accurately predicted future events, including deaths, accidents, political developments, and personal experiences that occurred days, weeks, or sometimes months after the dreams were experienced. Jung was particularly interested in dreams that predicted events that could not have been anticipated through normal logical analysis or intuitive extrapolation from existing circumstances, focusing on cases where the dream content was specific and detailed enough to rule out coincidence as a reasonable explanation. The predictive dreams often involved symbolic or metaphorical representations of future events rather than literal depictions, suggesting that the unconscious mind processed precognitive information through the same symbolic mechanisms that operated in ordinary dream formation. Jung's analysis of predictive dreams provided insights into the relationship between time and consciousness that challenged conventional assumptions about the linear nature of temporal experience. The scientific approach that Jung attempted to bring to dream telepathy research involved careful documentation of circumstances, verification of factual claims, and analysis of the psychological factors that seemed to facilitate or inhibit telepathic communication. Jung developed protocols for recording telepathic dreams that included detailed descriptions of dream content, documentation of the dreamer's psychological state, investigation of possible normal sources of information, and verification of the accuracy of dream predictions or telepathic perceptions. He was particularly careful to rule out cases where apparent telepathy could be explained by unconscious inference, forgotten memories, or coincidental similarities between dream content and external events. Jung's research methods were limited by the technology and scientific standards of his era, but he attempted to apply the same rigorous standards of evidence that he used in his other psychological research to the investigation of psychic phenomena. His systematic approach to documenting telepathic dreams created a valuable database of evidence that continues to be studied by researchers interested in the relationship between consciousness and psychic phenomena. The psychological conditions that seem to facilitate telepathic dreaming became a major focus of Jung's research, as he sought to understand the factors that made some individuals more susceptible to psychic experiences than others. Jung observed that telepathic dreams occurred most frequently among people who had strong emotional connections to each other, particularly family members, close friends, and individuals involved in intense therapeutic or romantic relationships. He also noted that telepathic dreams were more common during periods of psychological crisis, illness, or major life transitions, suggesting that heightened emotional states or reduced ego defenses might create conditions that allowed unconscious communication to occur more easily. Jung found that individuals who were naturally intuitive, or who had developed the capacity for active imagination through psychological work, seemed to be more likely to experience telepathic dreams than those who relied primarily on rational and analytical thinking processes. These observations led Jung to hypothesize that telepathic communication might be a natural capacity of the unconscious mind that was inhibited by the rational defenses and perceptual filters of normal waking consciousness. The relationship between telepathic dreams and Jung's theory of the collective unconscious provided a theoretical framework for understanding how psychic communication might operate through shared archetypal structures rather than through direct mind-to-mind contact. Jung suggested that individuals who were psychologically attuned to similar archetypal patterns might be able to access information about each other's experiences through their connection to the collective unconscious, which served as a kind of shared psychological field that transcended individual consciousness. This theory provided an alternative to explanations of telepathy that required direct communication between individual minds, suggesting instead that psychic phenomena might operate through participation in collective psychological structures that contained information about the experiences and intentions of all individuals who were connected to them. Jung's theoretical approach to telepathy was consistent with his broader understanding of the psyche as a system that extended beyond individual consciousness to include collective and archetypal dimensions that could influence individual experience in ways that transcended normal causal relationships. The documentation of spontaneous telepathic experiences that Jung collected from correspondents around the world provided evidence that psychic phenomena were cross-cultural and universal rather than being limited to particular religious or cultural traditions. Jung received letters from people in many different countries who reported telepathic dreams and other psychic experiences, and he found that the basic characteristics of these phenomena remained consistent across different cultural backgrounds and belief systems. This cross-cultural consistency suggested that telepathic abilities might be natural human capacities that were not dependent on particular beliefs or cultural training, though the interpretation and integration of psychic experiences were clearly influenced by cultural and religious frameworks. Jung's international correspondence about psychic phenomena provided additional evidence for his theory of the collective unconscious and demonstrated how archetypal patterns could manifest through telepathic experiences that transcended individual and cultural boundaries. The universality of telepathic phenomena supported Jung's understanding of the psyche as a system that included transpersonal dimensions that connected individual consciousness to larger patterns of meaning and experience. The practical implications of Jung's dream telepathy research for therapeutic practice were significant, as they suggested that the healing relationship might involve unconscious communication processes that were not acknowledged by conventional psychotherapy. Jung's observations of telepathic communication between therapists and patients indicated that successful therapy might depend not only on conscious techniques and interpretations, but also on unconscious attunement and empathetic connection that operated through psychic channels. This understanding led Jung to pay careful attention to his own dreams and intuitive impressions about patients, recognizing that unconscious communication might provide valuable therapeutic information that was not available through conventional analytical methods. Jung's integration of psychic phenomena into his therapeutic approach represented a significant departure from the materialistic assumptions of mainstream psychology and demonstrated his willingness to expand the theoretical foundations of psychotherapy to include transpersonal and spiritual dimensions of healing. The telepathic aspects of the therapeutic relationship that Jung documented continue to influence contemporary discussions about the role of unconscious communication and energetic attunement in psychological healing and personal transformation. Part 16. The African Expedition Revelations. In 1925, Jung embarked on what he called the Bugishu Psychological Expedition to East Africa, a journey that would fundamentally alter his understanding of consciousness and expose troubling contradictions in his own psychological theories. Accompanied by his English friend Peter Baines and American associate George Beckwith, Jung travelled through Kenya and Uganda to the slopes of Mount Elgon, ostensibly to study what he termed primitive psychology among culturally isolated tribes. However, Jung would later admit that the expedition was less about objective scientific research and more about confronting the disturbing question of what would happen to Jung, the psychologist, in the wilds of Africa. The journey became a psychological mirror that reflected both the depth of Jung's insights and the troubling racial prejudices of his era. Jung's initial fascination with African consciousness was based on his belief that he could observe humanity in its primitive state, untouched by the complexities of modern European civilization. He viewed the Elgonyi, Bugishu and other African peoples as living examples of unconscious wholeness, operating from instinct and archetypal patterns rather than the fragmented consciousness he observed in European patients. Jung was particularly struck by what he interpreted as the Africans' immediate connection to the rhythms of nature and their apparent lack of the psychological splitting that characterized modern Western consciousness. He observed their sunrise rituals with fascination, seeing in their worship of the daily rebirth of light a direct expression of the archetypal patterns he had discovered in his research. The concept of going black emerged as Jung's most psychologically dangerous encounter with African consciousness, representing his fear of losing his European identity and rational faculties. During the expedition, Jung experienced a powerful dream in which an American Negro barber from Chattanooga was holding a red-hot curling iron to his head, intending to make his hair kinky and give him Negro hair. Jung interpreted this dream as a warning from his unconscious that he was in danger of psychological contamination, of losing his civilized European consciousness and descending into what he viewed as primitive mentality. This fear revealed the deep-seated racial prejudices that influenced Jung's supposedly objective psychological observations and called into question his ability to truly understand the consciousness he was studying. Jung's experiences with malaria and sandfly fever during the expedition may have contributed to the psychological crisis he faced, as his reduced physical resistance left him more vulnerable to what he called psychic infections. The fever-induced altered states of consciousness blurred the boundaries between observer and observed, forcing Jung to confront the uncomfortable possibility that his scientific detachment was an illusion. He found himself drawn into the rhythms and consciousness patterns of the people he was studying, experiencing a dissolution of ego boundaries that was both fascinating and terrifying. This experience provided Jung with first-hand evidence for his theories about the collective unconscious, while simultaneously challenging his assumptions about the superiority of European rational consciousness. The colonial context of Jung's expedition cannot be separated from his psychological observations, as his entire framework for understanding African consciousness was shaped by the power dynamics and racial hierarchies of the British colonial system. Jung travelled as a privileged European scientist, protected by colonial authorities and viewing African peoples through the lens of evolutionary psychology that positioned them as earlier stages of human development. His descriptions of Africans as simple souls without consciousness reflected the colonial ideology that justified European domination through claims of civilizational superiority. This colonial mindset prevented Jung from recognizing the sophisticated spiritual and psychological traditions of the African peoples he encountered, reducing their complex cultural systems to primitive expressions of archetypal patterns. Jung's encounter with the Masai Laibon, or traditional healer, provided him with glimpses of psychological wisdom that challenged his preconceptions about primitive mentality. He observed rituals involving the sprinkling of milk and spitting to balance the forces of light and darkness, recognizing in these practices sophisticated understandings of psychological principles that paralleled his own discoveries about the integration of opposites. However, Jung's colonial framework prevented him from fully appreciating these practices as equal to European psychological knowledge, instead interpreting them as unconscious expressions of universal truths that only Europeans could consciously understand and articulate. This intellectual colonialism reflected Jung's inability to escape the racist assumptions of his cultural background, even when confronted with evidence that contradicted those assumptions. The psychological transformation that Jung underwent during the African expedition was profound, but also deeply problematic, as it reinforced rather than challenged his beliefs about racial and cultural hierarchies. Jung returned to Europe convinced that he had witnessed the origins of human consciousness and gained crucial insights into the archetypal foundations of the psyche. However, his interpretations were filtered through evolutionary assumptions that positioned African consciousness as primitive and European consciousness as advanced, preventing him from recognizing the possibility that different cultural traditions might represent equally valid approaches to psychological development. The expedition ultimately revealed more about Jung's own psychological complexes and cultural limitations than about the consciousness of the African peoples he claimed to study. The lasting impact of the African expedition on Jung's theoretical development was significant, providing him with experiential evidence for his concepts of the collective unconscious and archetypal patterns, while also revealing the troubling extent to which his psychological theories were shaped by racist assumptions. Jung's experiences in Africa contributed to his understanding of how consciousness emerges from unconscious foundations and how modern civilization both enhances and fragments human psychological wholeness. However, the expedition also demonstrated the dangers of psychological colonialism, where supposedly objective scientific research serves to reinforce existing power structures and cultural prejudices rather than challenging them through genuine encounter with different ways of understanding consciousness and reality. Part 17. The Astrology Studies. Jung's most controversial scientific experiment involved a systematic statistical analysis of astrological compatibility among married couples, a study that would challenge conventional scientific assumptions while providing evidence for his theory of synchronicity. Between 1948 and 1955, Jung collected birth data from nearly 500 married couples, creating approximately 1,000 individual horoscope charts that he subjected to rigorous statistical analysis. This massive undertaking represented Jung's attempt to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom traditions and modern scientific methodology, seeking empirical evidence for meaningful connections that could not be explained through conventional causal relationships. The results would prove both intriguing and controversial, providing support for synchronicity, while raising serious questions about the influence of experimenter expectations on statistical outcomes. The methodology Jung developed for his astrological research involved comparing the positions of the Sun, Moon, Venus and Mars in the charts of married couples with similar measurements from randomly paired individuals who were not married to each other. Jung's hypothesis was that married couples would show statistically significant correlations in their astrological charts that would not appear in random pairings, particularly in the traditional marriage aspects that astrologers had claimed for centuries indicated romantic compatibility. He divided his data into 3 separate batches to test the consistency of his results, using sophisticated statistical methods to calculate the probability that the observed correlations could have occurred by chance alone. The experiments were conducted with the assistance of Jung's colleagues, who helped ensure that proper scientific protocols were followed throughout the data collection and analysis process. The results of Jung's astrological experiments appeared to confirm the traditional astrological claims about marriage compatibility, with statistically significant correlations appearing between the charts of married couples that did not exist in the control groups. The most striking results involved moon-sun conjunctions, where one partner's moon was in the same zodiacal position as the other partner's sun, a configuration that astrologers had long considered favourable for marriage. Jung calculated that the probability of obtaining such results by chance alone was extremely low, ranging from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000, depending on which batch of data was analysed. These findings seemed to provide empirical support for both astrological theory and Jung's concept of synchronicity, suggesting that meaningful connections could exist between psychological states and astronomical configurations. The scientific community's reaction to Jung's astrological research was overwhelmingly negative, with critics attacking both his methodology and his interpretation of the results. Statisticians pointed out that Jung's sample was not randomly selected, as he had relied on couples who were willing to provide their birth data, potentially introducing selection bias that could skew the results. Other critics noted that Jung and his assistants were not blind to the hypothesis being tested, creating the possibility that unconscious bias could influence the data collection and analysis process. Modern reanalyses of Jung's data have found that his statistical calculations contained errors, and that the probability of obtaining his results by chance was actually much higher than he reported, undermining the apparent significance of his findings. Jung himself recognized the problematic aspects of his astrological research, acknowledging that the expectations and hopes of the researchers may have influenced the results through what he called synchronistic arrangement. He observed that the statistical correlations seemed to decline over time as the research progressed, suggesting that the initial enthusiasm and faith of the experimenters may have contributed to the early positive results. This observation led Jung to conclude that synchronicity itself might be responsible for the experimental outcomes, with the meaningful connections between astrological charts and marriage compatibility manifesting precisely because the researchers believed in and expected such connections to exist. This interpretation transformed the apparent failure of scientific objectivity into evidence for the reality of a causal connecting principles that operated through the psychological states of the observers. The broader implications of Jung's astrological studies extended far beyond the question of whether astrology was scientifically valid to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of scientific methodology and the role of consciousness in experimental research. Jung argued that conventional scientific approaches, which attempted to eliminate all subjective factors from experimental procedures, might be inadequate for studying phenomena that involved meaningful connections between mind and reality. He suggested that some aspects of human experience might require participatory research methods that acknowledge the active role of consciousness in creating the very phenomena being studied. This perspective anticipated later developments in quantum physics and consciousness studies that would question the possibility of completely objective observation and highlight the participatory nature of all knowledge acquisition. Jung's use of astrology as a research tool reflected his broader interest in traditional wisdom systems that claimed to reveal hidden connections between human psychology and cosmic patterns. He viewed astrological symbolism as a sophisticated language for describing psychological types and developmental processes, regardless of whether the astronomical correlations were literally true. Jung found that astrological concepts provided useful frameworks for understanding personality dynamics, relationship patterns, and the timing of psychological transformations in ways that complemented and enriched his analytical psychology. The horoscope served as a kind of psychological map that could guide therapeutic work and self-understanding, offering symbolic representations of archetypal patterns and developmental potentials that might not be accessible through other means. The controversies surrounding Jung's astrological research highlighted the tension between his roles as a scientific researcher and as an explorer of spiritual and esoteric traditions. While Jung maintained his commitment to empirical investigation and statistical analysis, his willingness to seriously study phenomena that mainstream science dismissed as superstition put him at odds with the increasingly materialistic orientation of academic psychology. Jung's astrological studies represented his attempt to expand the boundaries of scientific inquiry to include meaningful connections and synchronistic phenomena that could not be reduced to mechanical cause and effect relationships. This expansion required new methodological approaches and theoretical frameworks that could accommodate both objective measurement and subjective meaning, creating a more comprehensive understanding of human experience that honored both scientific rigor and spiritual insight. The astrological experiments, whatever their ultimate scientific validity, demonstrated Jung's courage in pursuing research into areas that his professional colleagues considered dangerous territory, maintaining his commitment to exploring the full range of human consciousness regardless of social and academic pressures. Part 18. The Death Visions of 1944 Inches. In early 1944, at the age of 68, Carl Jung suffered a heart attack that brought him to the very threshold of death and precipitated the most profound spiritual experience of his entire life. The medical crisis began when Jung broke his foot in a winter accident, and while hospitalized, he suffered a massive cardiac event that left him unconscious for days while doctors fought to save his life. During this period of unconsciousness, Jung experienced a series of extraordinary visions that he would later describe as more real and meaningful than any ordinary waking experience. These near-death visions would fundamentally transform Jung's understanding of consciousness, death, and the continuity of existence beyond physical life. providing him with direct experiential knowledge of the transcendent dimensions of reality he had previously encountered only through his patient's dreams and his own psychological research. The visionary journey began with Jung finding himself floating high above the Earth, observing the planet from a cosmic perspective that revealed its beautiful blue luminescence and the continents spread out far below. Jung felt an extraordinary sense of freedom and liberation, as if he were finally being released from the constraints and limitations of earthly existence. As he floated in space, Jung encountered a massive dark stone, like a meteorite the size of a house, which had been hollowed out to form a temple similar to those he had seen on the coast of the Gulf of Bengal. At the entrance to this cosmic temple sat a Hindu figure in white robes, silently waiting in lotus position, and Jung understood with absolute certainty that this being expected him and that he was about to enter into the most profound experience of his existence. The temple experience represented what Jung interpreted as the approach to ultimate knowledge and understanding, where all the fragmented pieces of his life and work would finally be revealed in their complete and unified meaning. Jung felt that upon entering the temple, he would meet all the people to whom he truly belonged, and would finally understand the historical and cosmic significance of his individual existence. He anticipated learning why he had come into being, where his life was flowing, and how his personal journey fitted into the larger patterns of human development and spiritual evolution. This approaching moment of total illumination filled Jung with intense anticipation and joy as he sensed that he was about to receive answers to the deepest questions that had driven his entire life's work in psychology and spiritual exploration. The vision was interrupted by the appearance of Jung's earthly doctor, who manifested in the cosmic realm as a messenger from the earthly plane, with the authority to call Jung back from his transcendent journey. The doctor appeared to Jung as a divine figure, a prince of Kos, representing the ancient Greek healing god Asclepius, and communicated through telepathic exchange that Jung had no right to leave the Earth at this time. The doctor explained that there was a protest against Jung's departure and that he must return to complete his earthly work and responsibilities. Jung felt profound disappointment and resentment at being forced to return to what now seemed like the narrow confines and limitations of physical existence, having glimpsed the infinite freedom and knowledge that awaited beyond the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. Following his return to physical consciousness, Jung experienced 3 weeks of additional visionary states that provided him with glimpses of transcendent realities and mystical experiences of extraordinary beauty and meaning. These visions included encounters with the marriage of the Lamb in a festively decorated Jerusalem, where Jung experienced himself as participating in archetypal patterns of spiritual union and cosmic harmony. He witnessed classical scenes of the sacred marriage between Zeus and Hera, representing the mystical union of opposing forces and the achievement of perfect psychological and spiritual integration. These experiences filled Jung with indescribable bliss and provided him with direct knowledge of what he called the odour of sanctity and the mysterium conjunctionis, the mysterious conjunction of opposites that represented the ultimate goal of psychological and spiritual development. The profound impact of the 1944 visions on Jung's remaining work and worldview cannot be overstated, as they provided him with experiential confirmation of the transcendent dimensions of reality that had previously been matters of theoretical speculation. Jung's encounters with death and the beyond gave him unshakable conviction about the continuity of consciousness after physical death and the existence of transpersonal realms of meaning and purpose. These experiences influenced his later writings on religious psychology, his understanding of the individuation process, and his approach to working with patients facing their own mortality and spiritual crises. Jung's famous statement in his final BBC interview that he didn't believe in God but knew reflected the direct experiential knowledge he had gained through his near-death encounter with transcendent reality. The visions also had a tragic personal dimension, as Jung's mystical experiences were accompanied by the prophetic knowledge that his doctor would soon die. During the cosmic encounter, Jung had perceived that the doctor's life was in danger, and indeed, on the very day that Jung was able to sit up in bed for the first time since his illness, his physician took to his own deathbed and never recovered. This synchronistic connection between Jung's visionary knowledge and subsequent physical events provided additional evidence for the reality of the transpersonal dimensions of consciousness that Jung had encountered during his near-death experience. The doctor's death served as confirmation that Jung's cosmic visions contained genuine prophetic elements and were not merely hallucinations produced by his medical condition. The integration of the 1944 death visions into Jung's psychological theories required him to expand his understanding of consciousness to include transpersonal and transcendent dimensions that extended far beyond individual psychology. Jung's direct experience of cosmic consciousness and ultimate meaning provided him with a new appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of the individuation process and the possibility that psychological development continued beyond physical death. These insights influenced his later work on religious experience, his understanding of the self-archetype as a transcendent organizing principle, and his recognition that the deepest healing often involved connecting individuals to sources of meaning that extended beyond personal psychological conflicts to encompass universal spiritual truths. The death visions of 1944 thus represented both the culmination of Jung's lifelong exploration of the unconscious mind and his initiation into direct knowledge of the transpersonal realms that lay beyond the boundaries of ordinary psychological experience. Part 19. Secret Patient Files. The most controversial and carefully guarded aspects of Jung's clinical practice involved his unconventional therapeutic relationships with patients whose identities and treatment details were kept secret for decades after his death. Jung's approach to therapy often blurred the traditional boundaries between doctor and patient, leading to intense personal relationships that included romantic entanglements, ongoing correspondences, and collaborative research projects that extended far beyond conventional treatment protocols. The most famous and thoroughly documented of these controversial relationships was his affair with Sabina Spielrein, a Russian patient who became first his lover and later his colleague in the psychoanalytic movement. Recently released documents and correspondence have revealed the extent to which Jung's personal and professional lives became entangled in ways that would be considered serious ethical violations by modern therapeutic standards. Sabina Spielrein's case files reveal the complex dynamics that characterized many of Jung's most intensive therapeutic relationships, beginning with her admission to the Burgholzli Hospital in 1904 at the age of 19. Spielrein had suffered a psychological breakdown following traumatic childhood experiences and the death of her sister, displaying symptoms of hysteria that included uncontrollable emotional outbursts and compulsive behaviors. Jung's treatment methods included not only conventional therapeutic techniques, but also private sessions in darkened rooms and the deliberate cultivation of intense emotional and intellectual intimacy that eventually developed into romantic attachment. Spielrein's diaries and letters, discovered decades after her death, document the progression of their relationship from therapeutic alliance to passionate love affair, revealing the extent to which Jung's personal desires and psychological theories became intertwined in his clinical practice. The ethical controversies surrounding Jung's patient relationships reflect broader questions about the boundaries of therapeutic practice and the potential for abuse of power inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. Jung's defenders argue that his unconventional methods were part of his pioneering exploration of depth psychology, and that his intense personal involvement with patients was necessary for understanding the deepest levels of unconscious processes. However, critics point out that Jung's sexual relationships with vulnerable patients represented clear violations of professional ethics and potentially caused psychological harm to individuals who had sought his help for mental health problems. The power differential between Jung as the famous doctor and his patients as troubled individuals seeking healing created conditions where truly informed consent was impossible and where patients might feel pressured to comply with their therapist's desires regardless of their own wishes or well-being. The recently released documents reveal that Jung's controversial patient relationships were part of a broader pattern of boundary violations that included financial arrangements, social relationships, and ongoing personal involvement that continued long after formal therapy had ended. Jung often remained in correspondence with former patients for years or decades, offering ongoing guidance and support, while also drawing upon their experiences for his research and theoretical development. Some patients became part of Jung's inner circle of followers and collaborators, blurring the lines between therapy, friendship, and professional partnership in ways that made it difficult to determine where treatment ended and personal relationship began. These arrangements raised questions about exploitation and dependency, as patients might feel obligated to maintain relationships with Jung in order to continue receiving his psychological guidance and support. The impact of Jung's controversial therapeutic practices on his female patients was particularly significant, as many of these women struggled to establish independent professional and personal identities while remaining psychologically connected to their former therapist. Spielrein's career as a psychoanalyst was both enabled and limited by her relationship with Jung, as she gained access to professional opportunities through his connections while also being overshadowed by his fame and reputation. Other female patients faced similar challenges in trying to separate their own psychological development from their relationships with Jung, sometimes spending years or decades working through the complex emotions and dependencies that had developed during their therapeutic relationships. The secret files revealed the extent to which Jung's therapeutic methods, however innovative and insightful, sometimes created new psychological problems even as they addressed the original issues that had brought patients to seek treatment. The concealment of these controversial patient relationships for decades after Jung's death reflects the ongoing efforts by his family, followers, and professional institutions to protect his reputation and preserve his standing as a scientific pioneer. Many documents related to Jung's most problematic therapeutic practices were sealed in family archives or destroyed to prevent damage to his professional legacy and to protect the privacy of the patients and families involved. The gradual release of some of these materials in recent decades has provided historians and scholars with new insights into Jung's methods and their consequences, while also raising uncomfortable questions about how much of his theoretical development was based on ethically questionable clinical practices. The secret patient files thus represent both a valuable historical resource for understanding the development of depth psychology and a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of therapeutic experimentation conducted without adequate ethical oversight or professional accountability. The broader implications of Jung's secret patient files extend beyond questions of individual ethical lapses to encompass fundamental issues about the relationship between personal experience and scientific knowledge in the development of psychological theories. Jung's most innovative concepts often emerged from his intensive work with specific patients whose psychological processes he studied in extraordinary detail over extended periods of time. The question remains whether the insights gained through these intensive and often problematic relationships could have been achieved through more conventional and ethically appropriate therapeutic methods, or whether Jung's willingness to transgress professional boundaries was a necessary component of his pioneering exploration of unconscious processes. The secret patient files thus present a complex legacy that challenges us to separate the valuable psychological insights Jung contributed to human understanding from the questionable methods he sometimes used to obtain those insights, while also highlighting the ongoing need for ethical guidelines and professional accountability in therapeutic practice. Part 20. The Hidden Legacy. The true extent of Carl Jung's experimental work and theoretical insights remains partially hidden even today, with significant portions of his research, personal writings and controversial discoveries sealed in family archives or deliberately suppressed to protect his reputation and avoid challenging established psychological orthodoxy. Jung's heirs have maintained strict control over access to his most personal and potentially explosive materials, including detailed records of his occult experiments, extensive correspondence about his intelligence work, and intimate documentation of his therapeutic relationships with prominent patients. The family's decisions about what to publish and what to keep secret have shaped the public understanding of Jung's legacy for more than 60 years since his death, creating a sanitized version of his work that emphasizes his acceptable psychological theories while downplaying his involvement in controversial areas of research. This hidden legacy includes not only suppressed experiments and unpublished writings, but also ongoing validation attempts by modern researchers who are seeking to verify Jung's most controversial claims using contemporary scientific methods. The suppressed experiments that remain in Jung's private archives reportedly include detailed documentation of his most ambitious synchronicity research, extensive records of his collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli on the connections between psychology and quantum physics, and comprehensive analyses of telepathic and precognitive phenomena that he observed in his clinical practice. These materials are said to contain statistical data, experimental protocols, and theoretical formulations that go far beyond what Jung was willing to publish during his lifetime, when he was already facing criticism from the scientific community for his involvement in areas considered pseudoscientific. The suppressed materials also allegedly include Jung's most detailed analyses of his own psychological experiences, including complete records of his conversations with inner figures, detailed documentation of his active imagination sessions, and comprehensive interpretations of his own dreams and visions that reveal the full extent of his self-experimentation. These personal documents would provide unprecedented insight into Jung's psychological development and the experiential foundations of his theoretical work, but they remain locked away from scholarly examination. Family secret revelations that have emerged in recent decades suggest that Jung's personal life and professional work were even more unconventional and controversial than previously known, with implications that extend beyond his individual biography to encompass broader questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. Statements by family members and former associates hint at experiments and experiences that Jung considered too dangerous or too far ahead of their time to be shared with the public, including alleged contacts with non-human intelligences, documented instances of psychokinetic phenomena, and systematic investigations into the survival of consciousness after death. These revelations, while often lacking detailed documentation, suggest that Jung's exploration of the boundaries between psychology and spirituality went much further than his published works indicate, and that he may have discovered connections between mind and reality that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The family's continued secrecy about these matters reflects both their desire to protect Jung's scientific reputation and their recognition that some of his discoveries might be too radical for contemporary culture to accept or integrate. Modern validation attempts by researchers using sophisticated technologies and methodologies unknown in Jung's time have provided intriguing support for some of his most controversial claims, particularly in the areas of synchronicity, telepathy, and the reality of archetypal patterns in human experience. Contemporary studies of quantum entanglement and non-local correlations have revealed phenomena that parallel Jung's descriptions of meaningful coincidences and causal connections, while research in consciousness studies has documented telepathic and precognitive abilities that support his observations of psychic phenomena in therapeutic settings. Neurological research has identified brain structures and processes that appear to correlate with Jung's descriptions of archetypal activation and collective unconscious experiences, providing potential biological foundations for his psychological theories. However, the full validation of Jung's suppressed research remains impossible as long as the detailed experimental records and theoretical formulations remain hidden in family archives. The implications of Jung's hidden legacy extend far beyond historical curiosity to encompass fundamental questions about the future direction of psychological research and the integration of scientific and spiritual approaches to understanding consciousness. If Jung's suppressed experiments did indeed document repeatable phenomena that challenge materialist assumptions about the nature of mind and reality, then their continued concealment represents a significant obstacle to the advancement of human knowledge and understanding. The gradual release of some previously hidden materials has already led to new research directions and theoretical developments that are expanding the boundaries of conventional psychology and consciousness studies. The complete revelation of Jung's hidden legacy could potentially catalyze even more dramatic shifts in scientific paradigms and cultural worldviews, providing empirical foundations for more integrated approaches to understanding the full range of human experience. What Jung took to his grave may include not only specific experimental findings and theoretical insights, but also a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic reality that was too advanced for his historical period to comprehend or accept. Jung's frequent statements about having to withhold certain discoveries, and his references to knowledge that could be dangerous if misunderstood, suggest that he possessed insights about the nature of consciousness and reality that he considered too powerful or too far ahead of their time to be safely shared. These hidden insights may have included practical methods for accessing expanded states of consciousness, systematic approaches to developing psychic abilities, and comprehensive maps of the deeper structures of reality that integrated psychological, spiritual, and physical dimensions of existence. The continuing secrecy surrounding these materials reflects the complex legacy of a man who pushed the boundaries of human knowledge while recognizing the potential dangers of premature disclosure of revolutionary discoveries. The ultimate revelation of Jung's hidden legacy will likely depend on future generations of researchers and Jung's descendants who may be more willing to risk the controversy and misunderstanding that could accompany the release of his most radical experimental records and theoretical formulations. As scientific paradigms continue to evolve and become more open to non-materialist explanations of consciousness and reality, the time may come when Jung's suppressed discoveries can be properly evaluated and integrated into human knowledge. Until then, the hidden legacy of Carl Jung remains one of the great mysteries of 20th century science, a treasure trove of potentially revolutionary insights about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human potential that awaits future discovery and validation. The true measure of Jung's contribution to human understanding may only be fully appreciated when the complete scope of his experimental work and theoretical insights is finally revealed, transforming our understanding not only of psychology, but of the fundamental nature of existence itself.